I should begin, I think, with a rumour. Not a battle, not a coronation, not the fall of a kingdom, though all of those lurk in the background. Great stories rarely start where chroniclers place their little inked crosses. They begin where a whisper crosses a room and makes a few people frown, a few people laugh, and one person falls silent. In our case, the whisper was this: Cintra has burned, but the princess lives. I remember the night I first heard it. I was doing what I do best, turning disaster into song in a tavern that smelled of smoke, sour beer, and wet cloaks. My ballad of the Lioness of Cintra was new then, all polished phrases and careful pauses, grief served in neat verses to men who needed somewhere safe to put their sorrow. They listened. Some even cried. A good night's work for a humble artist of misery. When I finished, a man at the back said that not everyone had died. A child had escaped, he insisted, the granddaughter, the heir, the one bound to a certain white-haired witcher by an old and awkward law of surprise. As soon as he mentioned a witcher with pale hair, a few faces turned toward me. I kept my expression pleasantly blank. It is a useful talent. Later, when the benches were empty and the innkeeper was counting coins with a tenderness he had never shown another living soul, I sat with my lute and weighed that rumour. A living princess, somewhere in the ruins of the world. Geralt's destiny, if one accepted that destiny bothered with people like us. I had spent the evening singing of collapsing towers and broken gates. But it occurred to me that the true story might be beginning far from any battlefield, in a cold and quiet place where no songs had yet reached. As I travelled, the rumour followed, changing shape from town to town like smoke in a draught. In one village they said she had been smuggled out beneath a cart piled with bodies. In another, that she had ridden through the flames on a ghostly steed. Some swore Nilfgaard had taken her. Others said elves, witches, mages, or nameless gods. Everyone had a version. No one had proof. That is how you can tell that a story has sunk its hooks into the world. I listened, as bards must. We survive by collecting other people's half-finished tales, by storing them away until suddenly, years later, they begin to fit together. At the time, they were only interesting fragments. A girl in the ashes of Cintra, a debt of destiny, a witcher I knew too well to imagine him holding a child. I had walked beside Geralt on muddy roads. I had shared cramped rooms and uncomfortable silences. I knew his suspicion of anything resembling prophecy. Mention destiny, and his jaw would slacken in a way that meant he was grinding his teeth. So when people started linking his name quietly to a lost princess, I felt a mixture of amusement and unease. The world, I realized, did not care in the slightest whether he believed in fate. It had already cast him. Around us, the land grew taut as a lute string tuned too high. From the north came word of levies called up, and fields churned to mud by marching feet. From the south, rumours of Nilfgaardian banners massing like storm clouds. In markets, prices crept upward. At night, laughter in taverns grew louder and shorter, as if everyone were trying to drown out something only they could hear. Through that rising tension, the story of the girl endured, thin but unbroken. In Oxenfurt, a scholar with ink-stained fingers told me of ancient lines of blood and old prophecies that spoke of a child who could change the shape of the continent. In a border town, a maimed soldier swore he had seen a small figure in a green cloak led through smoke by a man with cat-yellow eyes. In a temple courtyard, a young novice whispered that sometimes the gods hid those they favoured when no one thought to look. I began, cautiously, to weave a few hints into my songs. A nameless child walking through fire, a witcher who turned toward the flames instead of away. I did not mention Cintra. I did not mention Geralt. I watched to see who in the crowd would stiffen, whose gaze would sharpen, who would lean in close. Some heard only another sad story. Some heard more. That is always the way. We receive a tale according to the fears we already carry. Looking back, I can see how small my experiments were beside what was already moving. I thought myself standing at the threshold of a possible legend, free to step in or turn away as I pleased. In truth, I was already inside it, and the central figure was a girl I had not yet met, training her body and will somewhere far from my applause. Perhaps you recognize the pattern. You go about your ordinary life, busy with bills, children, and the small, stubborn details of survival. A distant conflict appears in the news. A rumour passes through your office. You shake your head, make a polite comment, and continue with your day. Only later do you realize that a decision made in some far-off hall has altered the shape of your own days. A border closes, a price rises, a stranger crosses your path who would never have come otherwise. So it was with us. The fall of Cintra seemed at first like a tragedy to be sung and then put aside. A sorrow large enough to fill a night of music. A safe excuse for tears. Yet from that ruin walked a child who would draw kings' sorcerers, rebels, and old monsters into the same tightening orbit. At the time, though, all I knew for certain was that Geralt had disappeared, as he tends to do. One day you are arguing with him about nothing in particular. The next, he is gone, leaving behind an unfinished drink and the lingering sense that the room has lost some of its gravity. When Geralt vanishes, something important is usually happening somewhere else. From time to time, scraps of news about him reached me. A quiet man seen at a crossroads, a medallion shaped like a wolf's head glinting at his throat, a witcher wintering in a keep hidden among severe blue mountains, a place whose name people spoke rarely and softly. Kaer Morhen. I imagined him there, among worn stone and old companions, far from courts, prophecies, and frightened princes. What I did not yet know was that he was not alone. In that remote fortress, surrounded by snow and the smell of oil and steel, a thin, determined girl was learning to fall and rise again on bruised knees. She chased wooden dummies, cursed under her breath when the older witches laughed, and went to sleep aching in every limb. No bard was there to watch. Destiny prefers its first rehearsals to be private. Still, the rumour grew. People began to ask me outright, between songs, whether I believed it. Did the princess live? Was there truly a child of surprise? Had fate finally trapped the white wolf? I answered with a shrug, a clever rhyme, a jest that made them laugh and forget what they had asked. It is easier to make light of what disturbs us than to admit that we feel the world shifting under our feet. Yet even as I smiled, I listened more closely. Beneath the noise of markets and the clatter of taverns, I thought I heard the first faint notes of a new refrain. I did not yet know her name. To me, she was still only a story carried on other people's tongues, running away from a burning city toward a future none of us were prepared to meet. We like to assure ourselves that if we had known then what we know now, we would have chosen better, prepared more wisely, loved more bravely. But we still wonder whether any choice of ours could truly have altered the road already laid before that child, whose story, sooner than we imagined, would become the measure of our own. The first true image I have of Ciri is not one I saw with my own eyes. It came to me on creased paper in Geralt's own handwriting, which is only slightly tidier than a spider's drunken crawl. He had sent the letter north with a merchant caravan, knowing it would chase my tracks through villages and towns until it finally found me in a cramped room above a busy inn. There was nothing sentimental about it. Geralt writes as he speaks, cutting away anything that might look like adornment. He told me that winter had fallen hard on the keep of Kaer Morhen, that the passes were blocked, that supplies were short. He mentioned the names of the old witches in short, dry strokes: Vesemir, Lambert, Eskel, Cohen. And then, as if it were a minor detail, he added one line: "The girl is training." I read that line 3 times. The girl. Ciri of Cintra, child of surprise. The rumour in every tavern. A person reduced to 3 words by a man who had spent his life telling himself that bonds were dangerous, that to feel too much was to invite ruin. The girl is training. Somewhere behind that simple report I could hear the endless creak of the keep's old gates, the rings of steel, the shouts of men not used to schooling a child instead of a recruit. Geralt wrote that she rose before the sun most days, that she ran laps along the inner wall until her chest ached and her fingers went stiff with cold, that Vesemir watched with a mixture of worry and pride he tried to hide, that Lambert, who pretended impatience with all things small and fragile, carved her wooden practice swords and called her ugly nicknames that made her grin, that Eskel corrected her stance with quiet patience, nudging her foot a fraction left or right, that Cohen, younger than the rest, showed her how to breathe through fear instead of against it. There was one scene he described more fully, almost in spite of himself. The courtyard of Kaer Morhen, he wrote, had turned into a hard white sea. Snow lay packed between the old stones, and the wind knifed down from the peaks, bringing with it a taste of iron and pine. In the centre of that unforgiving space, they had rigged the old training obstacle, a narrow beam and swinging logs, relic of years when small witcher candidates were still brought to the fortress. Ciri climbed the wooden beam with an eagerness that made Vesemir swear under his breath. She was slight, bones like willow, hair a pale mess beneath a too large fur cap. The first time she tried to cross, a swinging log caught her calf and rolled her into the snow. She lay there for a moment, stunned, breath forced from her lungs, watching a grey sky that seemed to press down forever. In that silence, Geralt said nothing. Neither did the others. The only sounds were the creak of chains and the restless sigh of the wind. Then she scrambled up, cheeks burning, snow clinging to her battered trousers. She spat a curse that would have made a dock worker proud and climbed again. She fell many times. Each fall left its mark, a bruise blooming on her knee, a scrape across her knuckles, a dull ache in her shoulder where she struck the beam. Yet each time she climbed with the same stubborn fury, as if the obstacle had insulted her personally. There is a kind of pride in some children that borders on recklessness, the refusal to let the world see them break. By the time she crossed the beam from end to end without falling, the light was already fading. Her breath fumed in the air. Her cap had vanished somewhere in the snow, her hair tangled with frost. Geralt wrote that she stood there on the far side, chest heaving, eyes bright, then raised both fists in triumph toward the old men watching her. Lambert whooped. Vesemir grumbled that it had taken too long. Cohen clapped once, sharply, like a commander approving a soldier. Geralt only wrote this. She did not give up. It is a strange thing to hold a scene you never witnessed entirely inside your mind. I could see her there, in that desolate courtyard, as clearly as if I had been leaning in the shadows near the wall. Lute forgotten at my side. The snow, the creak of wood, the bruises hidden beneath worn cloth. The child who refused to stay down. All of us have our own training grounds, though most do not involve swinging logs and ancient witches shouting advice. For some, it is a cramped kitchen where a parent drops hints about bills and expectations. For others, it is a school corridor where you learn which part of yourself is safe to show and which must be hidden away. We stumble, we fall, we spit a curse, we climb again. The world rarely applauds, but it notices who refuses to stay where they fell. In my trade, practice means sore fingers and a back twisted from too many hours spent perched on stools not designed for dignity. There is no snow unless the roof is leaky and the winter particularly cruel. Yet, when I read about Ciri slipping and rising again, I recognized the rhythm. The first time you try to hold an audience, you fail. They turn away. They talk over your voice. They leave. You climb back onto the metaphorical beam the next night and try again. Bruises hidden beneath your best shirt. Geralt's letter spoke little of tenderness. That was not his way. Even when he admitted concern, it was in sideways phrases. He wrote that Ciri cried out sometimes in her sleep, words he could not understand, names he did not recognize, that she woke with a knife in her hand once, wild-eyed, until she saw his face, and the blade loosened from her fingers, that when the snow fell thickest and the keep seemed cut off from the rest of existence, she would sometimes stand on the battlements and stare south, toward a city that no longer stood. I read those lines slowly. Between them I could hear everything he did not say. A child whose past had burned. A man whose life had been carved into him by other people's decisions, now placed in charge of a smaller, more fragile life. In the noise of taverns and marketplaces, people spoke of royal blood and ancient rites. Geralt spoke of nightmares and bruises, of a girl learning to fall without breaking. It told me which story mattered. He made no mention of destiny in that letter, not once. He did not speak of prophecy or the designs of kings and mages. He wrote instead about the practicalities of training someone who could not be given the potions that had shaped the witches, about how her growth, her humanity, her very ordinary limitations forced them to adapt. They lowered walls, changed exercises, invented new drills. The old fortress, built for a now forbidden purpose, had to learn a different kind of teaching. There is something quietly radical about that. The world around them measured Ciri by what her blood might be worth. The witches of Kaer Morhen, grumbling and awkward, measured her by how quickly she could roll out of the way of a swinging log. One count is written in thrones and treaties, the other in bruises and laughter. One serves empires, the other serves a single small person. From far away, I tried to imagine her days as he described them. Mornings in the courtyard, afternoons in the armory, evenings by the hearth, where someone would eventually hand her a bowl of hot stew and a cup of something weak and sweet. Perhaps she listened with wide eyes when Vesemir told old stories of hunts long past. Perhaps she argued with Lambert over card games and lost more often than she won. Perhaps she tried on an old, dented piece of armour and turned, laughing, to show Geralt how ridiculous it looked. Those images soothed me. They wrapped the girl from the rumours in something approaching normality, even if that normality was rough and lined with steel. Yet, at the edge of every imagined scene, winter pressed close. Beyond the walls, armies shuffled in the dark. Banners were counted, borders weighed. Alliances whispered over spiced wine. The child balanced on a beam above snow. The world sharpened its knives. It is easy, from a distance, to tell ourselves that someone is safe simply because they are surrounded by stone and watched over by men with swords. It is tempting to believe that a stronghold can hold back everything that hunts a person. But we still wonder whether there is any wall high enough, any routine strict enough, to keep out the forces that travel unseen. Memory, dream, the long reach of other people's desires. When I folded Geralt's letter and slipped it back into its envelope, I felt a curious ache, a mixture of pride and dread. Somewhere high in the mountains, a girl I had never met was learning how to fall and rise again, shaping herself into something that could not easily be broken. I told myself that this was good, that strength was what she needed. Yet a part of me, softer and more cowardly perhaps, wished that she could have been training for some smaller life, one in which the only thing depending on her balance was her own narrow beam of happiness. I have never seen Kaer Morhen in the flesh of winter, only in the lean lines of other people's stories. The mountains, they say, rise like teeth against a colourless sky. The keep itself is a scar of stone pressed into a cliff, its windows narrow, its halls smelling of old oil, steel, and the stubbornness of men who refuse to leave the past alone. Yet I can almost feel the chill of it when I think of the day Triss Merigold arrived there. I heard the tale from her much later, in a quiet room, where the shutters rattled and someone downstairs was attempting my ballads with more enthusiasm than talent. Triss sat across from me with her hands wrapped around a mug she did not drink from, and told me about a fortress full of witches who could face down monsters, but not the mysteries of a growing girl. She had been summoned in a way that did not resemble a formal request. Geralt never did learn the art of polite petition. His letter to her, she said, was shorter even than the one he sent me, but the edges were sharpened by worry. Ciri was changing. There were fainting fits, fevers that passed too quickly to be ordinary, visions that left her hollow-eyed. There were also other matters that a hall full of mutated bachelors was particularly unqualified to address. Triss rode into the courtyard of Kaer Morhen and found winter waiting for her with its arms fully open. Snow had settled on the battlements and drifted against the old doors. The witches stood there like pieces carved from different kinds of rock, each worn in a different way. And in front of them stood Ciri, cheeks reddened by cold and effort, a wooden sword in her hand. It was, Triss told me, like walking into a family portrait no one had consented to pose for. The witches had hardened their lives into routines. Maintenance of weapons, patrols along paths no one used anymore. Training drills inherited from a time when small boys were brought to the keep and turned into something not quite human. Ciri's arrival had disturbed all of that, like a melody intruding into a march. My friends would never admit it, but they had begun to orbit her. Their conversations, their quarrels, even their silences had shifted to include the space where she stood. Triss watched Geralt watch the girl. She told me that what struck her was not tenderness, though there was some of that, poorly concealed. It was fear. Not fear of the enemies that gathered beyond the mountains, nor of the powers stirring within Ciri's blood, but fear of his own inadequacy. Geralt could face down a creature from a nightmare with a shrug. Faced with a child's future, he looked for the first time unsure of the right angle of his sword. In the evenings, they gathered in the draughty hall where a fire fought heroically against the cold. Ciri would eat between Vesemir and Geralt, the older man urging extra spoonfuls on her, as if a few more bites could protect her from the world. Lambert and Eskel would argue over tactics and monsters, and Ciri would listen with wide eyes, committing each detail to memory. Triss, used to courts where words were measured like spices, watched this rough affection with an expression that mixed amusement and alarm. She told me that the girl smelled of horse leather, and the particular kind of sweat that comes from pushing one's body past its limits. Her hands were calloused in places that would have scandalized the governesses of any royal court. She swore too easily and corrected her stance with a seriousness that would have made a fencing master proud. Yet, when she thought no one was watching, she traced the rim of her cup with one finger, as if following the shape of some half-remembered crest. Triss saw, as only a sorceress used to reading people sees, the gaps in the girl's education. Ciri could describe the anatomy of a basilisk, but not the politics of the kingdoms that would fight over her. She could read the faint traces of tracks in snow, but not always the subtler tracks in conversation. The witches had given her strength and resilience, but no one had truly stopped to teach her why so many eyes were turned invisibly toward her. Outside the stronghold, the world continued to tighten its grip. Letters arrived late and rumpled, carrying news of skirmishes, shifting alliances, debates in council chambers where maps were spread and cut to pieces in men's minds, long before any armies marched. Triss read them by candlelight in a small chamber, the wax dripping onto the margins. She felt the distance between that fortress and the places where crowns trembled, and wondered which was more dangerous to the girl sleeping down the corridor. She tried to talk to Geralt about it. I can hear their conversation almost as if I had been sitting on the stairs, eavesdropping shamelessly. Triss speaking quietly about prophecy and bloodlines, about the designs of sorcerers and kings. Geralt replying with his usual refusals, insisting that Ciri was a child first and foremost, not some promised key to the future. Two people who cared for the same person, arguing not about whether she should be protected, but how. In the midst of these heavy themes, there were moments that sounded almost ordinary. Triss laughed, telling me how Ciri tried to imitate the witch's habit of brooding in corners, and failed each time because curiosity dragged her back into the circle of light. She described an afternoon when Lambert attempted to teach the girl a particularly crude card game, only to have Vesemir confiscate the deck and deliver a lecture on proper influences that made Triss hide a smile behind her hand. These small domestic absurdities matter more than we admit. They are the threads that keep people from unravelling entirely when the world outside their walls turns hostile. A joke over a badly cooked stew, a shared complaint about the cold, a teasing remark about someone's habit of sharpening blades for too long. Anyone who has lived through a strange or difficult season knows this. Even in offices and apartments far from war, we use trivial rituals to hold back the sense that something larger and more dangerous is edging closer. Yet, beneath the jokes and the awkward dinners, Triss could feel something older and stranger moving through Ciri. When the girl's eyes unfocused and her voice slipped into words that did not belong to any ordinary tongue, when she woke from dreams with knowledge she could not have gained from books or training. The witches looked to Triss as if she might be able to anchor this rising tide. She could stabilize, soothe, teach, but even she understood that she was treating symptoms, not roots. She told me that one night, after Ciri had finally slept without crying out, she stepped onto the battlements to clear her head. The sky was a sharp, unsympathetic black scattered with hard stars. The wind smelled of iron and distance. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay cities where nobles were already calculating the advantages of having or killing a girl like Ciri. Somewhere far to the south, an emperor in black armour traced lines on a map. Between those distant figures and the sleeping child stood a handful of tired witches and one determined sorceress. It did not feel like enough. Listening to Triss, I found myself thinking about how often we mistake walls for safety. We imagine that distance from the centres of power will spare those we love, that if we keep them in hidden valleys or quiet villages, the wider storms will pass overhead without touching them. Yet history, both grand and intimate, suggests something else. Stories travel. Greed does not respect geography. Prophecies are particularly talented at climbing mountains. Ciri's days at Kaer Morhen, as Triss described them, were a strange mixture of childhood and preparation for something no child should have to face. She slipped on ice and laughed as she fell, then spent hours in the evening tracing runes under Triss's guidance. She pestered Vesemir for another story about the monsters of the past, then went pale when a half-remembered vision overlapped with his words. She was both a girl learning to swing a sword and a symbol onto which many invisible hands were already reaching. When Triss finished her account, she fell silent for a long time. The noise from the tavern below rose and fell. Another singer trying to turn chaos into something that could be endured. I looked at her and thought about that remote keep, those men who had not been trained to be fathers, and the girl who had been given to them by a twist of fate that no one fully understood. We tell ourselves, whenever we look back, that we were doing the best we could with what we knew at the time. It is a comforting idea, but we still wonder whether, in places like that fortress, among people who cared yet felt powerless, there might have been ways to see more clearly what was coming, to prepare a little better for the day when snow and stone would no longer be enough to keep the world at bay. Triss, being Triss, refused to accept that a child's world should consist solely of bruises, cold air, and men who thought a clean shirt counted as emotional development. Once she had taken stock of Kaer Morhen and its inhabitants, she made what I can only call a quiet decision of war, not against monsters, nor against Nilfgaard, nor even against prophecy. Her chosen battlefield was smaller and, in its way, more ambitious. Ciri's daily life. I was not there to see the first shots fired, but I have heard the story enough times to picture it. The morning after one especially grueling training session, Triss announced, with the calm certainty of someone used to bending nobles to her will, that Ciri would not be going straight back to the obstacle course. There would be a lesson. She said the word lesson in a tone that made even Vesemir blink. "Is she not learning already?" he apparently asked, gesturing toward the courtyard where Ciri had lately been attempting to decapitate wooden dummies with admirable enthusiasm. "She is learning to fight," Triss replied. "Now she must learn to live." From a battered chest she had insisted on bringing up the mountain, Triss produced a modest armoury of her own, books bound in fading leather, a set of ink and quills, pieces of parchment, a pair of plain but decent dresses, a small jar of fragrant oil, and a comb designed for hair far more cooperative than Ciri's. She set them out on a table in a chamber hastily cleared of old equipment and declared it a schoolroom. Ciri took one look at the dresses and scowled. The witches shifted uneasily, as if facing a foe for which they had not trained. Geralt, I am told, looked between the dresses and the wooden swords, as though asked to choose between two equally incomprehensible futures. Triss ignored them all with the serene ferocity of someone who has decided that there will be an afternoon set aside for handwriting, no matter how many monsters exist beyond the walls. So the girl who had spent her morning learning how to roll out of a sword's path found herself sitting at a narrow table, fingers stained with ink, copying letters. Her hand, accustomed to gripping a hilt, cramped. The quill snagged on rough parchment. She grumbled, but Triss coached her through each line, praising the neat strokes, gently correcting the wild ones. You and I know this feeling, the boredom of the classroom after the vivid chaos of the playground, the way the mind resists sitting still when the body is used to movement. In the afternoons, when training allowed, Triss shifted from letters to stories. She brought out histories of the northern kingdoms, tales of long-ago peace treaties and petty squabbles that had grown into full wars. She spoke of the elder speech, of places where ancient ruins poked through the soil like the bones of forgotten beasts. She did not say, not yet, that Ciri's blood was tangled with those old lines. Instead, she gave the girl a map of the world that was more than a series of targets and hiding places. Ciri listened with a frown at first, as if trying to understand how any of this equaled the satisfaction of landing a clean blow with a practice sword. But slowly, almost in spite of herself, she began to ask questions. Why did this border move? Why did that king break his oath? Why did people who shared a language and a river still choose to hate each other? These are the questions children ask when they are still honest enough to be surprised by cruelty. They are also the questions that, unanswered, grow into the weary cynicism of later years. Triss did not have all the answers. No one does. But she answered as best she could. and where she could not explain, she gave Ciri something else, the habit of thinking about the world as a web of causes and consequences, not merely a landscape to be traversed with a blade. That habit, once learned, is difficult to unlearn. It will trouble you whenever you read headlines or hear of distant conflicts, nudging you to ask what came before and who benefits. Of course, life at Kaer Morhen did not transform overnight into the curriculum of a royal academy. There were moments of comedy. One evening Triss decided that Ciri must learn proper table manners. Vesemir, mortally offended by the suggestion that his household had anything to learn in that area, insisted on participating. The result, by all accounts, was a dinner during which Lambert attempted to balance cutlery correctly. Eskel kept forgetting which hand held which utensil, and Ciri dissolved into giggles at the sight of witches sitting stiffly upright as if the chairs had sprouted spikes. "Does it matter how I hold the spoon if the stew is good?" Lambert protested. "It matters," Triss said, "because there are people who will weigh your worth on such trivialities. Better to know their rules before you decide which ones to break. I cannot fault that logic. We move through many rooms in our lives where the unspoken codes are as sharp as any trap. Learning to recognize them is not submission, merely strategy. Even a bard must know when to bow, when to smirk, and when to pretend not to hear an insult for the sake of a continued paying engagement." Triss also insisted on small rituals of care, regular baths, even in water that made one's teeth chatter. Hair combed and plaited instead of left to do battle with the wind. Clothes mended neatly, torn hems sewn with fingers that would rather have been wrapped around a sword. Ciri complained, sometimes loudly, that she was being treated like a doll. Yet there were mornings when she lingered a moment at the small mirror Triss had hung by the door, adjusting a braid or smoothing a sleeve before charging out into the cold. It is a strange, tender defiance to insist on softness in a place built for hardness. Triss knew that others in the world already saw Ciri as a tool, an heir, a key. In Kaer Morhen, she tried to ensure that the girl would at least have memories of hot soup, clean linen, and evenings spent curled in a chair by the fire with a book. These are not trivial luxuries. They are the materials from which a sense of self is constructed. The quiet conviction that one's value lies in more than one's usefulness to others. There were more delicate lessons, too, the kind that do not appear in heroic chronicles. Conversations about choosing who was allowed close, about listening to the discomfort that rises in the body before the mind can explain why. Triss approached these subjects awkwardly at first, more used to navigating court intrigues than a child's bewildered questions. But slowly, patient as a gardener coaxing life from stubborn soil, she offered Ciri the beginnings of language for her own boundaries. Ciri, who had been handed from king to witcher to sorceress, by forces beyond her control, needed those words more than most. Perhaps you remember, in your own earlier years, the first time someone told you that you were allowed to refuse a touch, to say no even when politeness suggested yes. Such lessons rarely feel grand at the time, but they shape the way a person moves through a world eager to claim them. From the letters and retellings that reached me, I constructed my own mental picture of those days. Mornings in which Ciri's breath smoked in the air as she ran, afternoons bent over pages where ink dried slowly in the cold, evenings when her laughter bounced off stone as Lambert lost yet another argument about grammar. A life stitched together from steel and stories, from sweat and the slow, stubborn work of learning to read both books and people. It would be easy to dismiss these gentle additions to her schedule as footnotes in the grand saga of armies and conspiracies gathering beyond the mountains. Yet I suspect they mattered as much as any secret council. Destiny, if it exists, tends to concern itself with sweeping patterns, with battles, with fallen crowns. It is indifferent to whether a girl knows how to set a table or greet a guest without flinching. But the person living inside that story is not indifferent. Small comforts, habits of thought, moments of beauty snatched between drills. These are what keep an individual from dissolving entirely into a role written by others. Years later, when I finally met Ciri properly, I recognized traces of Triss in her that had nothing to do with magic. A certain way of listening to stories, weighing them against what she had seen. A half-suppressed eye-roll at pompous etiquette, coupled with the ability to navigate it gracefully when necessary. A stubborn insistence that even in the midst of danger there should be time for a hot drink and a joke. That is the legacy of someone who has been taught not only how to fight, but how to be a person worth fighting for. We like to imagine that strength comes solely from hardship, that the more a child endures, the better prepared they will be. It is an appealing story, tidy and free of obligation. Yet we still wonder whether, without those stolen pockets of normality, Triss carved out in that bleak fortress, the girl from Cintra could have borne the weight that the world was preparing to lay on her thin, determined shoulders. There are some things that even witches cannot cut down with a sword. Nightmares, for instance, do not respond well to steel. If they did, half the veterans I know would sleep more soundly, and my own memories would be far less crowded. At Kaer Morhen, as winter wore on, Ciri's training bruised her muscles and toughened her reflexes, but it did nothing to silence the fire that still lived behind her eyes. The first time Triss told me about Ciri's visions, she chose her words with that careful precision that means someone is trying not to frighten themselves. The girl had begun to wake in the middle of the night, she said, with frost on her lashes and sweat on her skin, whispering phrases in an old tongue that made even Vesemir look sharply toward the door, as if expecting the past to walk in. Sometimes Ciri spoke of fire, not the ordinary hearth-front kind, but a red wave swallowing streets, roofs folding like paper, a sky stained the color of hot metal. She would gasp, reaching out with her hands as if trying to drag someone out of the flames. Other times she described stone circles, black monoliths planted in wild places, humming with a sound that was more of feeling than noise. Once, Triss said, the child sat bolt upright and demanded to know who had opened a tower that did not yet exist. Then she blinked, confused, and could not remember having spoken. When these episodes passed, Ciri insisted that she was fine. Children are experts at pretending. She laughed too loudly at breakfast, sparred too fiercely in the yard, tried to outrun whatever she had seen by sheer force of motion. But the shadows under her eyes darkened. The witches, not easily rattled, began to trade glances over her head. They had been trained to face external threats, claws, fangs, curses muttered in ruined cellars. They could not draw their swords against a memory that might not even be hers. Triss approached the problem as a mage does, carefully, methodically, anchors in place. She sat with Ciri in a quiet chamber, the fire banked low, candles sending up shy flames. She taught the girl how to breathe through the fear when visions came, how to name what she was feeling, how to separate the now of the stone room from the then of the burning city in her mind. She avoided grand declarations about destiny. There is little comfort in being told that one's suffering is meaningful on a larger scale. She also tried, cautiously, to look within. Magic can heal, stabilize, smooth the edges of jagged experiences, but it is not a needle and thread one can insert without risk. When Triss touched her power to Ciri's, she felt something that did not behave like ordinary talent. It was deeper and older, like a river forced underground and now seeking whatever cracks it could find. Elder blood, the scholars would call it, a lineage braided through with prophecy, accident, and the kind of planning that makes my skin crawl. Triss did not tell Ciri all of this. You do not hand a child a book of prophecies and expect her to sleep well afterward. Instead, she offered gentler metaphors. Your gift is strong, she would say, but it must learn manners. It is like a wild horse that has been shut up too long. It needs guidance, paths, a rider who knows when to pull the reins and when to let it run. Ciri, who understood horses far better than she understood bloodlines, listened. There were setbacks. One afternoon, after a session that left them both exhausted, Ciri stumbled out of the chamber and into the hall where the witches were gathered. Her eyes were not quite her own. She spoke in a voice that seemed layered, as if someone older and angrier were standing behind her. Words poured out about revenge, about burning thrones, about daughters returning to claim debts unpaid. Then she collapsed, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. When Triss told me this, she did not repeat the exact phrases. She is too aware of the power of words to scatter them carelessly. But the fear in her voice was enough. For a breathless moment, those in that hall had not been looking at Ciri, the girl they had watched fall and rise on frozen beams. They had seen something else gaze out through her, something with a long memory for injustice and a short patience for compromise. In the days that followed, they adjusted. They always adjusted. Training sessions were shortened when the girl's face grew too pale. Lamplight in the evenings was kept softer. Geralt spent more time sitting with Ciri by the fire, telling her about monsters that could be outwitted rather than slain, as if reminding her that there were ways to face danger that did not involve becoming it. Triss wove protective charms into the girl's blankets. Faint, almost invisible patterns of power meant not to block the visions entirely. That was impossible, but to blunt their sharpest edges. If you find yourself thinking that this sounds like a household tiptoeing around a fragile ornament, let me correct you. Ciri was not fragile, not in any ordinary sense. She still threw herself into sword drills with reckless enthusiasm, still shouted rude things at Lambert when he deserved it, still sulked when Vesemir denied her a second helping of pudding. The human heart is capable of holding terror and exuberance at the same time. That contradiction is, in fact, one of our most enduring talents. So, the witches and Triss tried to offer both structure and kindness. Routines are a kind of spell in themselves, binding the day together so that what happens in the night cannot entirely take over. Breakfast, at the same time. Drills, lessons, a walk along the wall with Geralt, during which he pretended to be interested in her opinions about the shape of clouds while actually listening for any quiver in her voice that might suggest another vision was coming. Triss, meanwhile, began to keep a quiet record, not of every nightmare that would have been cruel, but of the patterns. Which moon, what weather, what had been discussed that day. She was trying to find any thread that might lead out of the maze. Over time, certain images repeated. The sound of hooves on stone, a tower on a cliff above storm-torn water, black banners against a white sky, and always, somewhere, the sense of being chased, not by soldiers or beasts, but by expectation itself, as if the future were not a distant horizon, but a pack of hounds on her heels. When Triss rode away from Kaer Morhen at the end of winter, she left behind more than the scent of her potions in the empty chambers. She left Ciri with a few simple exercises for calming the mind, with books whose margins she had filled with small notes of clarification and encouragement, with a comb carved with tiny flowers, as if to say that the girl was allowed to be ordinary sometimes. She also left with the uncomfortable knowledge that what lived in Ciri's blood would not stay politely contained forever. Listening to her, I felt the familiar helplessness that comes when confronted with someone else's pain that cannot simply be sung away. I could have composed a ballad about a child haunted by visions of a burning world, and perhaps audiences would have wept and gone home feeling cathartically improved. But it would not have lightened the burden for the girl herself by a feather's weight. Songs are powerful, but they are not cures. We comfort ourselves when we hear of children touched by forces beyond their choosing, with the idea that such gifts are always a blessing in disguise. We talk about resilience, about how hardship will make them stronger, wiser, destined for greatness. It is a lovely story, polished smooth from much repetition. Yet we still wonder whether, in quiet fortresses and small bedrooms everywhere, there are young people like Ciri who would gladly trade a grand destiny for an unremarkable life, in which their nights belonged only to them. There comes a moment in every story when questions stop circling above our heads and land right in the middle of the room. With Ciri, that moment arrived as winter began to loosen its grip on Kaer Morhen. The snow sagged from the walls, the icicles cracked and fell, but one thing remained hard and sharp as ever. What is to be done with the girl? Training could go on forever. There is always another drill, another scar, another ingenious way to fall on one's face. But neither Vesemir nor Triss were fools, and even Geralt's stubbornness is not limitless. A child cannot live her whole life in a fortress that smells of oil, steel, and old failures. Outside those walls, kingdoms were waking, councils were whispering, and an empire in black was calmly considering which pieces on the board were missing. Triss was the first to say the words. She chose an evening when the fire was low and the men were tired, when boasting had given way to silence. Ciri had been sent to bed, complaining loudly all the way up the stairs to prove that she was not in the least sleepy. Vesemir sat with a blanket around his shoulders, pretending it had simply landed there by accident. Geralt leaned against the hearth, half in shadow, his medallion tapping faintly against his chest with each slow breath. "This place cannot hold her forever," Triss said. The sentence fell between them like a log onto the fire, sending up sparks. It was not new. They had all thought it in their own ways. But thoughts are easy to ignore. Spoken aloud, the truth took on weight. Kaer Morhen had been built for unwanted boys taken from forgotten villages, for children no one would come searching for. It had not been built for a lost princess, whose bloodline wound through every succession law and half the prophecies in the archives. Geralt reacted as you might expect, not with shouting. He is not that kind of man. He simply went still, then asked where the world could possibly be safer than a keep full of witches. It is a fair question if one is thinking only of monsters with claws. Triss did not answer immediately, because she was thinking of different monsters entirely. In the mountains, steel and snow could hold back bandits. Wolves? Even the odd, enthusiastic assassin. But they could not hold back attention. Rulers have long memories and longer fears. Sorcerers have mirrors and crystals that see further than any scout. Spies live quite happily on overheard rumours and inconvenient coincidences. Each day that Ciri stayed hidden among the witches, she became both stronger and more valuable as a prize. Triss laid it out gently, though gentleness did not soften the message. Ciri needed more than sword forms and a few lessons squeezed between bruises. She needed a mage capable of facing whatever slept in her blood. She needed words for the things that were happening to her, maps of politics and history, names for the currents moving beneath the surface of events. She needed, quite simply, people who knew how to raise a girl. Geralt and the others had done what they could. It was not nothing. They had given her discipline, resilience, and a sense that she was cared for, even if no one said it out loud. But they could not teach her what it meant to be the centre of so many invisible calculations. They could not show her how to walk into a court and leave with her soul intact. Vesemir, who had watched generations of boys arrive and leave, understood sooner than Geralt. The keep, he said, was never meant to be a permanent harbour. Even witches returned only for winters and repairs. To pretend that stone alone could hide Ciri forever was to cling to a comforting lie, and he had buried too many lies already. So the question changed from if to where. Triss spoke of a temple devoted to the goddess Melitele, a place where prayer and common sense shared the same roof. There, she said, lived a priestess named Nenneker, whose tongue was sharp enough to cut a king down to size, and whose compassion was, regrettably for her enemies, just as formidable. The temple stood at a crossroads, respected by most, ignored by a few, and watched by nearly everyone. For Ciri, it could be a pause in the march of events, a season in which she could breathe like an ordinary girl. Beyond that loomed another possibility, Aretusa, the Isle of the Sorceresses. Triss mentioned it quietly, as if the word itself might summon a council. The women who guided their order had long ears for talk of elder blood. They would, Triss knew, see Ciri as a rare metal to be refined, shaped, perhaps forged into a blade. She did not relish the thought of delivering the child to such a furnace. Geralt listened. From anyone else, that might mean indifference. From him, it means something is being weighed on a scale whose markings only he can see. At last, he said that he would not hand Ciri to anyone who saw her only as a sign. If kings and mages wanted to draw lines through her name on their maps, they could do it without his blessing. She was a person, not a prophecy written in flesh. He meant it. The cruel joke, of course, is that even refusing to choose is a choice. To keep Ciri away from courts and conclaves was itself a political act. To send her to a temple rather than a palace or academy drew its own quiet lines. Neutrality looks clean only from a distance. Up close, it is a position like any other, simply one wrapped in the hope that no one will force you to declare it. In the end, because stories cannot stay still forever, a decision was made. Ciri would leave Kaer Morhen when the passes opened. Triss would go with her. Geralt would ride at least part of the way, like a man escorting both his greatest fear and his greatest comfort down from the mountains. Vesemir accepted this, as he had accepted so many departures, with a nod, a sigh, and the kind of advice that sounds practical but hides affection in every word. At first, no one asked Ciri what she wanted. Adults often convince themselves this is kindness. They say they are sparing the child worry. In truth, more often than not, they are sparing themselves the pain of seeing fear and anger in a smaller face. But children learn to read silence long before they learn to read books. Ciri felt the change in the air. When Geralt finally told her plainly that she would be leaving the keep, the reaction was swift. Anger came first, bright and almost comforting in its clarity. She shouted that she had trained, that she was getting good, that she did not want to trade snow and steel for candles and prayers. To leave felt to her like being demoted from hero in training to helpless pawn. Geralt answered in the only way he knew, calmly, too calmly perhaps. He told her that the path of a witcher was closed to her. Without the brutal rituals that had shaped him and the others, she could not be what they were. He would not allow anyone to put her through them. He spoke of other kinds of strength, of battles that were fought with patience and understanding instead of blades. Fine ideas. They seldom ease the sting of hearing that the life you had begun to imagine is not meant for you. Ciri cried. How could she not? She had already lost a family, a city, a name that could be spoken in public. Now she was losing a place where, for a short season, she had felt herself more than a title. Tears came, hot and furious, then cooled. And then something else happened. Something I have seen in many young faces. She adapted. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, straightened her shoulders, and began asking practical questions. What should she pack? How long would the journey take? Would she be allowed to ride ahead sometimes? Resolve and grief walked side by side in her, neither cancelling the other. Adults call this resilience and praise it. Children simply call it surviving. When the passes finally opened, Kaer Morhen woke like an old beast roused from sleep. Saddles were repaired, cloaks patched, supplies carefully divided. Ciri walked along the walls one last time, tracing familiar cracks with her fingertips, counting the distant peaks as if reciting a litany. Vesemir pressed a small token into her palm, something worn smooth by years, precious only because it carried the weight of his unspoken blessing. Farewells were awkward, as they always are between people who prefer action to speech. Lambert covered his concern with insults so clumsy that they made Ciri laugh through her tears. Eskel promised that the beam in the courtyard would still be there, waiting to test her balance if she ever returned. Geralt checked the horse's tack 3 times over, as if careful straps could postpone the moment of departure. Triss pulled the girl's hood up against the lingering chill, and adjusted it with the absent-minded care of someone who has already begun to miss what she is touching. And then there was nothing left to do, no buckle left to tighten, no excuse left to stay. The gate of Kaer Morhen creaked open, complaining like an old friend abandoned to the snow. They rode out into a world that had not asked for them, but had been preparing quietly to receive them. Snow still clung in the deep shadows, but the road ahead was bare stone and mud, an honest surface for the hooves of destiny to strike. From a distance, when the tale first reached me, this all sounded neat, a necessary turn in the design, the moving of pieces to their proper places. But when I imagine it up close, I see half-finished sentences, hands that almost reach out and then retreat, things important and ordinary left unsaid. That is how most departures happen, even the ones that shape history. We walk into the future, dragging behind us all the words we were too afraid or too proud to speak. We tell ourselves, as they did then, that we are doing what is best, that any pain now will save greater hurt later, that there is such a thing as a correct path for a child whose name has already been written into other people's plans. Yet we still wonder whether every road leading away from that mountain held its own kind of danger, and whether any choice made in that dim hall could ever have freed Ciri from the long, invisible hands already reaching toward her life. If the road down from Kaer Morhen was made of stone and thawing snow, the roads I walked that spring were paved with rumours. They gathered in the corners of taverns and council chambers, in the gap between one song and the next. Somewhere in the mountains, Ciri was trading snow for mud and temple bells. Far away from her, men in crowns and fur-lined cloaks were learning to pronounce her name as if it belonged on their tongues. I moved as I always do, where the invitations and coin led me. One week I was in Oxenfurt, serenading students who knew more about philosophy than rent. The next, I found myself standing in the echoing hall of a minor duke, commissioned to provide background music while he discussed grain tariffs and troop movements with his advisors. You might think such topics would kill a performance. Strangely, they often sharpen it. People listening with half an ear to your song are easier to observe. Their faces relax. Their masks slip. In those rooms, I heard the shape of a different story than the one unfolding in mountain passes and temple courtyards. When kings and their servants spoke of Cintra, it was no longer in terms of mourning. Grief is a luxury courts cannot afford for long. They spoke instead of opportunity. A kingdom fallen is a gap on the map. A missing heir is an equation waiting to be solved in someone's favour. I remember one evening in Vizima, the air heavy with the smell of wax and wine. I had been invited to perform at a supper, the kind where everyone pretends to be relaxed while calculating each other's intentions with clinical interest. At one end of the table sat a Redanian envoy, his beard trimmed to a point sharp enough to draw blood. Opposite him lounged a Temerian noble whose rings flashed like little suns when he gestured. They spoke in careful circles about Nilfgaard's patience, about the cost of war, about the delicate balance between appearing strong and not provoking outright invasion. Each sentence was a chess move, each pause, a risk. And between the lines of their conversation walked a small, invisible figure, a girl who might or might not be alive, who might or might not carry a bloodline that could tilt that balance. "Assume she exists," the envoy said at last, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. I was close. Singers are often placed near power, on the assumption that melody is a kind of harmless decoration. It is an assumption I have never felt the need to correct. Assume the child of surprise lives. Ask yourself, my lord, whether you can afford to let your enemies get to her first. The Temerian's fingers tightened around his cup. For a heartbeat, I saw not a politician, but a man hearing the word enemy and tallying up the number of banners that could one day appear on his borders. Then he smiled, that particular courtier's smile that says nothing and everything. "If she exists," he replied, "and if someone knows where she is, then keeping her hidden is itself an aggressive act. Would you not agree?" On the surface, this was an abstract debate about hypotheticals. In truth, they were discussing chains and guardianship, treaties signed with ink and sealed with a girl's future. The question was not whether Ciri deserved a say. The question was who would get to raise her as a flag. Word reached me, too, of a more private gathering far to the north, in a place called Haag. There, behind locked doors and thick curtains, several kings had met without scribes or heralds. No ballads would be written about their supper. No triumphal arches would bear its date. But from that evening came agreements and suspicions that would shape years to come. I was not in Haag, but the tale filtered down in stages. A chamber where maps lay spread like flayed beasts, fingers tracing borders, stopping at the wound where Cintra should have been, voices arguing over how much trust to place in Nilfgaard's current quiet. And again, the same question. What of the girl? Some argued that if she was in Nilfgaardian hands, it would mean disaster. A legitimate claim to a conquered throne is better than any army. Others insisted that if she was hidden somewhere in the north, then whoever held her was playing a dangerously selfish game, hoarding a bargaining piece that might stabilize or shatter the fragile peace. Her name, or the idea of it, passed from mouth to mouth. Not spoken loudly, never written down, but implied in every phrase about guarantees, assurances, future heirs. To them, Ciri was both a threat and a solution, a variable that had to be found and fixed before anyone could sleep soundly. It is a peculiar thing, listening to such talk when you have watched the people they discuss wipe stew from their chins. I had seen Geralt's puzzled discomfort when someone tried to thank him too extravagantly, his way of shrugging off grand words as if they did not quite fit. I had never yet seen Ciri, but by then I had a series of letters describing her stubbornness, her laughter, her bruised knees. In the mouths of kings, they became something else. Assets, leverage, instruments. It reminded me uncomfortably of how patrons sometimes discuss musicians, not as people with lives outside the hall, but as resources to be deployed. We need something lively tonight. We need something solemn for a funeral. We need a child of elder blood to secure our borders. One evening in Oxenfurt, I found myself sharing a table with a man whose boots were too well made, whose questions were too careful. He claimed to be a minor official gathering reports about banditry, yet He steered the conversation, gently but persistently, toward any mention of golden-haired girls travelling with unusual companions. "Only idle curiosity," he said when I raised an eyebrow. "I enjoy a good story of coincidence." "Then you are in the right company," I answered lightly. "My life is a series of catastrophes pretending to be coincidences." He laughed, but his eyes remained cool. Long after he left, I thought of how many such men must be scattered across the north, asking similar questions in different inns, their casual inquiries knitting together into a net. Somewhere in that net, the memory of a girl riding through a village, stopping at a well, laughing at a merchant's joke, might catch and hold. News also came from the other side, from the Black Sun of Nilfgaard. Ambassadors spoke politely of peace while their emperor moved armies like pieces on a board. In whispers, people said that he had taken a Cintran princess as a bride in all but name, that he intended to unify his conquest of her kingdom with some older claim. Others denied it, insisting that the emperor would never bind himself to so unpredictable a bloodline. Truth and speculation danced together so closely that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. I played through it all, in bright halls hung with tapestries, in private studies that smelled of ink and old wood, in gardens where noble women pretended to stroll aimlessly while their guards listened for news of war. My songs, if I am honest, occasionally fed the frenzy. Bards are not innocent in the spread of rumours. A cleverly placed allusion here, an ambiguous verse there, and suddenly someone hears confirmation of what they already feared. At times, guilt pricked me. At other times, I told myself that silence would have changed nothing. When powerful people wish to believe something, they will find evidence even in the pattern of tea leaves. Still, I chose my words more carefully where the lost princess was concerned. I had no desire to be the spark that turned speculation into a hunt. If all this sounds distant and grand, let me assure you that it felt up close, messy and petty. These were not gods striding through destiny. They were men and women with indigestion and mistresses, worrying about taxes and the loyalty of their guards. Between discussions of prophecy and bloodlines, they fretted over the price of grain. In the pauses between weighing war and peace, they argued about the placement of a rival's banner at a ceremony. It is the same in smaller lives. In offices and boardrooms, you may know, important decisions are made about people who are never invited into the room. Promotions, layoffs, relocations, mergers. Somewhere, someone looks at a list of names and draws a line through one of them, and that person's whole life shifts. They are discussed in terms of cost, efficiency, potential. How skilled they are at cooking, singing, daydreaming, loving, almost never enters the calculation. Thus it was with Ciri. In the north, kings weighed whether her existence endangered or secured their reigns. In distant towers, mages whispered about elder blood, about the old hen Kaer and prophecies scratched into temple walls. In backrooms and shadowed corridors, spymasters traded information about sightings and false alarms, about girls who might have been her and were not. Each piece of gossip was a line on an invisible ledger. Through it all, the girl herself was absent, not only from those rooms, but from the minds of most who spoke of her. They did not picture her struggling with fear in the night, or squinting at ink-stained pages under Triss's supervision. or slipping on temple steps slick with rain. They saw a crown-shaped vacancy and something that might fill it. When I sang alone in more modest taverns, far from the polished floors of palaces, I sometimes allowed myself a different verse, one in which a child walked through a forest with people who cared for her, far from banners and council tables. In those small places, listeners heard only a story. They had no idea that their quiet tears and simple wishes for the girl's safety were kinder than half the well-planned strategies drafted by men with maps. We comfort ourselves with the thought that those who rule have a wider view, that their calculations, however cold, serve some greater balance. We hope that somewhere in those calculations, the human beings at their centre are seen as more than tools. But we still wonder whether, in rooms where power is divided and traded, there is ever enough space left over to imagine the weight that all those decisions place on a single pair of young shoulders. Geralt has always claimed that he does not take sides. If you have spent any time at all in his company, you will have heard the phrase. It appears in his vocabulary almost as often as the word no. He says it when kings offer coin, when villagers beg for help against soldiers, when bards like myself suggest that perhaps history will remember him more kindly if he occasionally chooses to stand somewhere visible. I am neutral, he will mutter, as if it were a shield thick enough to turn aside any accusation. For a long time I accepted this as one accepts the quirks of an old friend. Geralt hunts monsters, I told myself. He does not meddle in politics. He kills drowned dead and grave hags, not ideas. Let the kings and rebels cut each other to pieces. Let the world shift borders and allegiances like a drunk shuffles cards. My white-haired companion will be found somewhere on the margins, grumbling, polishing his swords, and insisting that none of it is his concern. But the world, regrettably, is not a polite tavern that respects such declarations. It has a habit of dragging even the most reluctant among us into its quarrels. By the time Ciri's name was being weighed in council chambers, Geralt's neutrality was beginning to cost more than either of us had imagined. News reached me, as it often does, in broken pieces. A raid here, a skirmish there. The Scoia'tael were on the move again, their name spoken with different flavours depending on who uttered it. To some, they were freedom fighters, to others, terrorists. To others, still a convenient tool. Elves and dwarves, mostly young, mostly angry, striking from forests and mountain paths against human convoys and patrols. I heard of one such convoy from Yarpen Zigrin himself. We met in a border town where the beer was thin and the stew thinner. He joined me at my table like a storm cloud pulling out a chair, his beard braided, his axe resting within easy reach even off-duty. Yarpen had once run with the Scoia'tael. Now he worked for human kings. People like to pretend such transformations are simple. They are not. They leave scars no armour can cover. Between mouthfuls of food he insisted was unworthy of the name, he told me about the job. A caravan, wagons loaded with something the king considered important enough to protect. Dwarves hired as guards because they knew the roads, the rocks, the likely ambush points. A witcher along for the ride, white hair catching the light, a girl at his side with eyes that missed little. "Did you just say, a girl?" I asked, my fingers tightening on my lute. Yarpen eyed me. "I did," he grunted. Thin, pale, rode like she'd been born in a saddle, made faces when she thought the Witcher wasn't looking. That one's not afraid of much, which is not always an advantage in this world. He did not know her name. Geralt had introduced her as his ward. Nothing more. But I knew. The image of her riding among dwarves on some muddy road snapped into place with all the inevitability of a rhyme you should have seen coming. Yarpen described the journey in the plain, unadorned prose of a man who has seen too many similar ones. Long days, short tempers, bad food, worse roads. Human merchants complaining about delays. Dwarven guards arguing about who was to blame for a broken axle. Every now and then the girl would ride up beside him, asking questions. About his time with the Scoia'tael, about why he had left. Too many idiots giving orders, he told her. Too many who thought dying for a cause was more important than living to see whether it had actually improved anything. It is not the sort of answer you find in stirring speeches. It is, however, very popular among those who have actually bled for banners. The ambush, when it came, was almost polite at first. Figures on the ridgeline, shadows between trees, the tense stillness of men and elves drawing bows in unison. The Scoia'tael stepped onto the road as if it belonged to them by right, emblems of the squirrel on their caps, eyes hard. They knew Yarpen. He knew them. Old comradeship flickered like a dying candle between them, then went out. They offered terms of a sort. Leave the wagons, walk away. Do not stand between us and the humans you serve. Neutrality would have been simple then, at least in the abstract. Geralt could have claimed he was merely a hired sword concerned with monsters, not politics. Ciri could have turned her horse and followed him out of the line of fire. Yarpen could have stepped aside, muttered that this was not his quarrel. The Scoia'tael could have taken what they wanted and vanished back into the trees. The king would have cursed, recalculated, sent another convoy with more guards and fewer scruples. The story would have been shorter. But that is not what happened. Yarpen chose his side. Whether you judge him for it will depend greatly on the colour of your own blood and the memories you carry. He stood with his current employers, not his former brothers-in-arms. Perhaps he had simply grown tired of being told who to hate. Perhaps he had decided that loyalty, once given, meant standing his ground even when every old wound in him screamed otherwise. Geralt, predictably, tried to remain what he called professional. His contract, after all, was to protect the caravan. But contracts are a flimsy thing when the people on either side of a conflict know your name. The Scoia'tael had no love for witches working with human kings. The humans in the wagons had no patience for witches who questioned their methods. Geralt could swing his sword at whoever swung first, but he could not pretend he was fighting only beasts. Ciri, I am told, watched all this with the terrible clarity of youth. She saw elves whose stories she had heard in gentler forms now drawing blood on a muddy road. She saw dwarves caught between old allegiances and new obligations. She saw her witcher, who claimed not to take sides, forced to spill blood that would stain more than his blade. When Yarpen finished his account, the tavern had emptied around us. The lanterns threw tired light across the table. He stared down at his hands, at the thick fingers that had shaped stone, swung axes, signed contracts. "Your friend," he said at last, "meaning Geralt?" he talks about staying out of it all. Standing apart. I used to think that was wise. Now I'm not so sure. The way things are, you can try to stay on the fence, but sooner or later someone will decide that the fence is on their side and drag you down into the mud anyway. I ordered another round. It seemed like the only reasonable response. We sat there, two aging veterans of very different professions, trying to swallow the knowledge that the lines being drawn across the continent were too thick to ignore. For a time, I tried to comfort myself with the idea that Ciri would take from these experiences only a sharper sense of justice, that seeing how both humans and non-humans can be cruel and kind in equal measure would make her wise rather than bitter, that watching Geralt flounder in the bog of neutrality would teach her to choose more clearly for herself. Perhaps some of that is true, but I cannot help imagining her on that road, mud on her boots, the taste of battle smoke in her mouth, listening to Yarpen curse in two languages at once, and to Geralt's strained attempts to explain that he was not, in fact, anyone's enemy, merely a man defending a contract. To a child, such distinctions must look painfully thin. We cling to neutrality when we fear the consequences of commitment. It feels safer to say, "I do not take sides," than to admit, "I am afraid of what choosing will cost me." Sometimes that fear is justified. Sometimes staying alive and able to protect even one person is more important than dying gloriously for an abstract cause. I will not condemn those who refuse to fling themselves into every conflict. I have avoided a few conscriptions myself with more creativity than courage. And yet, as the stories of that ambush and others like it piled up, as the Scoia'tael left bodies and burned wagons in their wake, as human reprisals grew uglier and more indiscriminate, it became clear that the space in which one could claim to be untouched by it all was shrinking. Roads were not neutral, villages were not neutral. Even songs were not entirely neutral anymore. A single verse could be taken as allegiance. Geralt would, I think, still insist that he does not fight for flags or causes. He fights for individuals, case by case, contract by contract, face by face. To some, that looks like cowardice. To others, like the only honest way to live in a world determined to turn people into symbols. I am too much his friend to judge him as harshly as his critics do. Still, when I think of Ciri riding beside Yarpen, seeing in one day how old loyalties can twist, how easy it is for yesterday's comrade to become today's target, I wonder what neutrality could possibly mean to her, to be a child carried back and forth across lines drawn by others, told she must belong to no one, and yet courted, hunted, fought over, as if she belonged to everyone. We tell ourselves, when we refrain from choosing, that we are preserving our freedom, that by staying above the fray we are somehow cleaner, wiser, less complicit. But we still wonder whether, for those standing in the middle of the road when both sides open fire, the absence of a chosen side feels any different from being used and wounded by all of them in turn. If there is one thing I envy Ciri for, it is this. Her first real journey through the world was not spent trailing behind a bard from tavern to tavern, but riding at the centre of a dwarven caravan. There are worse ways to be introduced to the chaos of the continent than in the company of Yarpen Zigrin and his lot, who treat danger like an old acquaintance and boredom as a personal insult. I was not there. while Geralt and Ciri rode through valleys and across stony ridges. I was in yet another smoky inn, hammering out rhymes for people who had never seen a mountain in their lives. Yet, when Yarpen later told me his version, and Geralt grudgingly filled in the spaces he refused to dignify with words, the road they travelled became almost as familiar to me as the path from my stool to the bar. The caravan set off under a sky the colour of unpolished steel. Wagons creaked and complained as they always do, each grown a reminder that commerce is simply stubbornness attached to wheels. Ciri rode near the front, the horse beneath her hooves steady and unremarkable in the best possible way. Beside her lumbered Yarpen on his sturdy pony, his beard braided, his eyes already scanning hills and tree lines by habit. Behind them trailed a small world on the move. For Ciri, the road was a ribbon of firsts. The first time she saw a proper market, not one half deserted by fear, but a living throng of farmers, traders, and children underfoot. The air thick with smells she had never encountered in Kaer Morhen, baking bread, damp wool, frying onions, horse sweat, and the sharp tang of someone trying to brew spirits without fully understanding the process. She stared at stalls where ribbons fluttered, at cages of noisy hens, at a toothless woman selling charms that promised good harvests and faithful lovers with equal confidence. Geralt tried in his own muted way to keep her from being overwhelmed. He taught her the useful art of looking without seeming to stare. He pointed out which traders weighed their goods honestly and which pressed a thumb on the scale. He let her ride a little ahead when the road broadened, then called her back when she strayed too near a cart driver whose patience had worn as thin as his boots. It was a clumsy sort of guardianship, protective yet wary of smothering, like a man unused to fragile things trying to carry a glass without gripping it too tightly. The dwarves, for their part, treated Ciri with a mixture of indulgence and merciless teasing. When she asked Yarpen why some houses in a village were neat and painted while others sagged, he snorted and told her to watch who went in and out. A well-kept door does not always mean a well-kept conscience, he said. She remembered that. Later, in some very different streets, she would use it. At night, they camped by the road, a ring of wagons forming a crude wall against the dark. Fires were lit, pots hung, arguments over seasoning broke out. The guards took turns on watch, while merchants snored the heavy sleep of people convinced that others exist mainly to protect their investments. Ciri sat close to the flames, her cloak wrapped around her shoulders, listening to stories that would never find their way into official histories. Dwarves tell tales the way they mine, straight down until they hit something solid, then sideways as the mood takes them. Yarpen spoke of mountains far to the east where the stone sings if you place your ear against it at dawn. Another of his crew, scarred and sharp-eyed, grumbled about a human officer who had once tried to pay them half their fee, and how he had learned that arguing with dwarves about money is like arguing with gravity. Geralt, when pressed, contributed a few brief, dry accounts of hunts that had gone wrong, each ending in survival more through luck than skill. Ciri listened, absorbing not only the content of the stories, but the rhythm of the lives they described. These were not heroes of legend. They were workers, mercenaries, men who had made too many compromises to claim purity, and too few to be entirely lost. Their loyalties were tangled. Their regrets were many. It must have been a bewildering education, for a girl whose earliest tales of elves and dwarves had likely been coloured by courtly prejudice and nursery simplicity. One afternoon, as the road wound between low hills dotted with scrub, Ciri rode up beside Yarpen and asked about the squirrel badges some of his former comrades still wore. She had seen them at a distance, on the ridges, in the nervous glances of passing farmers. The name Scoia'tael had reached even Kaer Morhen. Yarpen spat into the dust before he answered. He spoke of enthusiasm curdling into fanaticism, of young elves convinced that dying dramatically was more valuable than living long enough to build anything. He admitted that, for a time, he had believed the same. The world had beaten that belief out of him, one pointless raid at a time. There is always someone ready to tell you that your anger is sacred, he told her. They will hand you a cause and a weapon and say that nothing matters except the fight. Ask them what happens after the fighting. If their eyes go blank, walk away. That is the kind of advice most people are not mature enough to hear until they are too old to use it. Ciri filed it somewhere inside herself all the same. For all the looming threat, there were lighter moments. Once, when rain had turned the road into a brown river, a wagon wheel sank so deep that not even 6 dwarves could coax it free. Ciri and Geralt dismounted to help. Their boots vanished into the mud with such enthusiasm that Lambert would have laughed himself to tears if he had been there. By the time the wheel was coaxed back onto something resembling solidity, everyone involved was covered in a pattern of splashes so ridiculous that even Geralt's mouth twitched. Another evening, a peddler caught up with the caravan, leading a donkey so determined to stop that it redefined the concept. He spread his wares on a blanket, strings of beads, cheap knives, pots whose handles looked ready to part company with their bodies at the first opportunity. Ciri prowled around the display, fingers hovering over trinkets she did not quite dare to ask for. Yarpen, muttering about the foolishness of young girls, bought her a small wooden whistle carved in the shape of a bird. She tried it at once, producing a note so shrill that every horse within earshot objected. Geralt took the whistle, examined it as if it were a cursed relic, then handed it back with a soft instruction to use it sparingly. Ciri promised she would. She held to that promise only somewhat. Childhood clings to such fragile rebellions. In a life increasingly dictated by other people's plans, to choose when to annoy your guardians is a small but potent freedom. She also practiced with her sword when they stopped, working through forms against invisible opponents, while the dwarves pretended not to watch. They judged footwork as critically as they judged masonry. When she slipped, Yarpen barked an instruction. When she landed a particularly clean sequence, one of the others slapped a wagon plank approvingly and muttered something complimentary into his beard. Geralt observed these exchanges with a wary kind of pride. He had given Ciri the basics at Kaer Morhen. The road was now adding its own layers. She was learning when to draw steel and when to keep her hand from the hilt. She was learning that insults in taverns are sometimes best answered with laughter, that not every raised voice presages a fight, that not every kindness comes with a visible price. Of course, fate, if you choose to call it that, did not allow the journey to remain a simple education in trade and temperaments. The ambush in the gorge, which I have already spoken of through Yarpen's account, was the moment when the road revealed its teeth. Yet it matters that before that bite came, Ciri had seen other sides of the world. Fields ready for planting, children running after the caravan, laughing, an old woman pressing bread into her hands and crossing herself, as if warding off something she sensed without understanding. These small impressions sink deep, when later she would hear speeches about races and nations, about enemies and allies. She would carry with her the memory of dwarves arguing about stew, of elves glancing from the trees with expressions that held more weariness than hatred, of farmers who cared less about bloodlines than about whether the coming winter would be mild. From my stool in some distant inn, I liked to imagine her at night, lying under wagon canvas, listening to the wheels creak and the muffled snores of the men around her, whispering answers to questions no one had asked. What kind of life do I want? Who am I when no one is looking? Which of these voices shouting around me deserves to be taken seriously? We rarely recognize our first journeys as turning points. At the time, they are simply days strung together, a sequence of aches and new sights, of boredom punctuated by fear or delight. Only much later, looking back, do we see that certain roads taught us how to read the world and ourselves. Ciri's path with the dwarves did not last long in the measure of years. A few weeks, perhaps. Enough for the dust of the road to settle into her clothes and for their rough songs to lodge in her memory. Enough for her to glimpse that the continent was larger and more complicated than any fortress or temple. Whether it was enough to prepare her for what awaited her beyond the next bend is another matter. We still wonder whether any number of muddy miles and shared jokes can truly ready a child for the moment when the quarrels of kings and rebels close around her like a gorge, with no easy way out. The gorge, as Yarpen described it to me, was nothing special. That is how many terrible places begin, as stretches of land that cartographers mark without a second thought. A shallow cut in the earth, rock rising on either side, a narrow road pressed between them like a vein, the kind of place travellers curse for its draughts and echoing hooves, then forget once the ground evens out again. On that particular day, the sky was clearer than it had any right to be, thin light filtering down, making the stones seem almost polished. The caravan had been on the road long enough for nerves to settle into a dull ache. Wagon wheels groaned, harnesses creaked, someone cursed softly every time a loose stone jolted a load. Ciri rode near the front, cloak fastened tight against a wind that threaded through the gorge and played at being important. Yarpen, ever the pessimist, disguised as a realist, did not like the place. His eyes measured the slopes, counted the boulders that could hide archers, noted the narrowness of the path. He sent a few of his dwarves ahead and to the sides, their boots finding holes in the rock with practised ease. It was, by all accounts, a sensible precaution taken by someone who had no patience left for learning the same lessons twice. The first sign came not as a shout, but as an absence, birds falling silent, the creak of the wagons unchanged, the murmur of merchants ongoing, yet something in the air tilted. Geralt's medallion hummed against his chest, not with magic exactly, but with the disturbance that comes when too many intentions gather in one place. He nudged his horse a little closer to Ciri's and told her quietly to stay alert. Arrows did not rain down as they do in overexcited ballads. They arrived in measured lines, aimed at wheels, at harness straps, at the flanks of horses rather than the hearts of men. The scoia'tael stepped out from behind rocks and scrub, lean shapes with the squirrel emblem visible on caps and armour. elves mostly, a few dwarves. Faces hard, tired, young in the way of those who have decided that they will never grow old. They called out to Yarpen first. They knew him. Old names were flung across the space between them, bitter and fond in equal measure. Once they had fought the same enemies. Now lines had been drawn, and Yarpen stood on the side that paid him in coin rather than in promises. The demand was simple, as demands in such situations often are. Leave the wagons, leave the cargo, walk away. Do not stand between us and what we have chosen to strike at. Neutrality had no chair at that negotiating table. Geralt could not pretend that he was hunting a beast that had wandered out of its lair. Ciri could not pretend this was another training exercise with blunted blades and shouted corrections. The Scoia'tael were not nameless raiders. They were people whose songs and grievances she had heard in snatches, now standing with string-drawn taut on their bows. There was a moment, stretched thin as a bowstring, when it might still have gone differently. When Yarpen could have said that his loyalty extended only so far. When the merchants could have cut their losses. When Geralt could have urged Ciri's horse into a gallop and carried her back the way they had come. Perhaps then the Scoia'tael would have taken what they wanted and vanished, leaving only broken wheels and shaken men behind. Instead, words sharpened. The leader of the Scoia'tael spoke of human cruelty, of taxes and torched forests, of kin driven into ghettos. Yarpen answered with stories of raids gone wrong, of villages left smouldering, of orders given from comfortable hideouts by leaders who never risked their own skins. Each side carried a ledger of pain and betrayal. Neither was prepared to accept that the other's entries were real. A merchant, whose name history has not preserved, chose that moment to shout something foolish about property and law. An arrow took his hat clean off his head, a warning as delicate as it was terrifying. His face went the colour of old parchment. Someone's horse sidestepped. A loose stone rolled. The careful balance shattered. What followed was not a glorious clash, but a series of decisions made in the space of heartbeats. A dwarf raising his shield to protect a wheel rather than his own ribs. An elf releasing a second arrow because the first had not made its point strongly enough. Geralt drawing his sword with a reluctance that did not slow his arm. Ciri tightening her grip on her reins, mind racing through every lesson she had been taught about where to be and, more importantly, where not to be. She did not charge into the thick of it. For all her courage, Ciri was no fool. Geralt's first order, barked over the sudden noise, was for her to fall back toward the centre of the wagons. She obeyed, teeth clenched, the horse dancing beneath her, as shouts and the thud of feet on stone filled the gorge. From that vantage point she saw far more than anyone would have wished a child to see. She saw Yarpen's crew form a bristling knot around the most vulnerable parts of the caravan. Axes raised not merely to kill, but to ward off. She saw Scoia'tael dart in and out, using the rocks as cover, their movements sharp and practiced. She saw one of the younger dwarves hesitate when an elf he recognized rushed him, eyes full of something too tangled to name. The hesitation cost him a blow that left him winded but breathing. Later, when they retold it, that beat of almost recognition is what stayed in her mind. War in its early lessons is often less about bodies on the ground, and more about the collapse of the naive categories we cling to. Friend and foe us and them, right and wrong. Ciri had grown up with tales in which sides were clear. Monsters on one end, heroes on the other. Even Kaer Morhen, for all its rough ambiguity, had offered a sense of we, a circle of people inside which she belonged. In the gorge, those circles overlapped and split. The elves attacking the convoy were not faceless. Some wore braids like the ones she had once admired from the safe distance of a story. One shouted something in a language that made the air vibrate in her bones, a speech of anger that was also a prayer. The dwarves defending the wagons were not untainted. Their curses held old bitterness, their blows the weight of wages owed and debts collected. Geralt tried to keep the fight from turning into slaughter. He aimed for disarming cuts, for pushes that sent attackers sprawling rather than broken. He shouted warnings instead of threats. The Scoia'tael were not always inclined to accept such restraint. Some pulled back when they recognized the wolf medallion and remembered older stories of witches who had turned against human cruelty. Others saw only another sword raised in defense of the system that had starved them. At some point, an arrow hissed past Ciri's cheek, close enough that she felt its breath. It buried itself in the wooden side of a wagon behind her. The sound it made on impact was small, almost trivial, yet it drew a line across her understanding. In that instant, she was not a symbol, not an heir, not a child of surprise. She was a girl on a horse in a narrow cut of rock, one breath away from the end of every possibility. Later, when she spoke of it, she did not dwell on blood or on the faces of those who fell. She remembered instead the taste of dust in her mouth, the roughness of the rains against her palms, the way time seemed to slow and speed up in unpredictable bursts, how colours sharpened. The green of a strip of cloth around a Scoia'tael archer's arm, the dull glint of Yarpen's axe as it rose and fell, the white of Geralt's hair whipping as he turned to block a blow meant for a merchant too slow to duck. Eventually, as such things do when both sides realize that the cost is climbing far faster than any possible gain, the fight ebbed. The Scoia'tael, having failed to take the wagons quickly, faded back into the rocks. A few parting arrows, more for pride than effect. Then they were gone, leaving behind only the echo of their shouts and the unsettled knowledge that they could appear again wherever road and terrain pleased them. The convoy took stock. A man groaning with a bruise that would trouble him for weeks. A dwarf binding a shallow cut on his arm. A horse lamed, a wheel cracked. No one had died, which by the standards of such encounters counted as a mercy. Yet, when Ciri looked at the faces around her, she saw that something had still been lost. Some had shed illusions they had not known they were carrying. One of the merchants muttered about savages, voice shaking. Yarpen silenced him with a glare that spoke of old loyalties and newer disillusionments. Geralt cleaned his blade with movements that were a fraction more brittle than usual. He checked Ciri over with hands that did not quite tremble, asking her where she hurt, whether she felt faint, whether she could keep riding. She said she was fine. It was not entirely a lie. That night, by the campfire, the usual jokes came slower. Someone tried to start a song and abandoned it halfway through. Ciri sat between Geralt and a wagon wheel, the wooden whistle Yarpen had bought her tucked into her belt like a talisman. The flames threw restless shadows onto the sides of the wagons, making the old paint seem to move. In the privacy of her own thoughts, she replayed the day. The choice not to attack, the choice to defend, the choice to shoot at wheels instead of hearts until provoked. She wondered about the elves who had slipped back into the trees, where they slept. What stories they told themselves to make bearable the sight of dwarves once shared in camaraderie, now standing opposite them. We like to tell children that violence is committed by monsters, easily recognized and easily shunned. It is a comforting fiction. The truth, as Ciri began to learn in that gorge, is that harm often comes from hands that have also helped, from mouths that have spoken tenderness as well as threats. That makes the world harder to map, but perhaps also more honestly seen. Those of us who hear such stories second-hand have the luxury of turning them into metaphors, of wrapping them in melodies and hoping that distance will soften their edges. But we still wonder whether any song can fully convey the moment when a girl realizes that the road ahead of her will never again look entirely safe. That every bend may conceal not only danger, but someone whose face she might have trusted under different circumstances. Temples are strange places for people like me. They make a profession out of reverence, whereas I have always preferred improvisation. Still, there are a few sacred houses where even a bard feels at home, and the temple of Melitele at Elander is one of them. That is largely because of Nenneke, who presides over it with the air of a woman who has outlived fashion, war, and patience, in equal measure. By the time Ciri reached Elander, the road with Yarpen was behind her, its mud and echoes already hardening into memory. Geralt brought her to the temple gate, a wall of pale stone draped in ivy, bells chiming softly in the breeze like a nervous choir. The courtyard beyond was full of ordinary things: herb beds, laundry on lines, novices carrying baskets with the brisk solemnity of souls who believe that if they drop so much as a carrot, the world will end. For a girl who had slept under wagon canvas and in mountain keeps, the temple must have felt almost indecently peaceful. No clatter of swords, no shouted orders, only the rhythm of bells marking the hours, and the gentle chaos of women going about the work, of caring for bodies and spirits that arrive tired, wounded, and occasionally smug. Nenneke met them in the main hall, where the air smelled faintly of beeswax and old prayers. She was not what most people imagine when they think priestess. No floaty robes, no distant gaze. Solid, sharp-eyed, with a jaw that suggested its owner had never lost an argument she meant to win. When she saw Geralt, her expression flickered through recognition, exasperation, and something quieter that she would rather have swallowed a live toad than name. This, Geralt told her, is Ciri. He did not add whose child she was, or what blood flowed in her veins, or how many kings had lately been worrying over the question of her existence. Nenneke was too experienced to need footnotes. She looked the girl over, not the way merchants look at horses, but the way gardeners examine a sapling that has survived a storm, checking for damage, measuring the strength of the stem, weighing how best to replant it. Ciri, for her part, stared back. She had seen witches, dwarves, elves in the distance, ennobled merchants, grubby innkeepers. A priestess who radiated authority like heat from sun-warmed stone was a new experience. Later she would tell me that her first impression of Nenneke was that the woman reminded her of Vesemir, if he had traded his sword for a broom and discovered sarcasm. The arrangement was simple on the surface. Ciri would stay at the temple for a time. She would study, rest, learn things the witches could not teach her. The temple was neutral ground, or as close to it as any place on the continent could claim to be. Pilgrims came from many kingdoms to seek blessing, medicine, or merely a night's shelter. To harm a guest under Melitele's roof was to invite the kind of universal disapproval that even ambitious men hesitate to court. Beneath that simplicity lay layers of negotiation I did not witness, though I have a fair idea how they sounded. Geralt insisting that Ciri was not to be paraded as a holy relic or a curiosity. Nenneke making it blisteringly clear that no one, king or mage, would remove the girl from her care without stepping over her still warm body. Between them, Triss's name and Yennefer's, spoken in tones that would have set any listening walls trembling with anticipation. Geralt did not stay long. He is not built for temples. The slow pace, the ritual, the way every word seems to echo a little louder under vaulted ceilings. None of it suits a man more comfortable on roads and in poorly lit inns. He made his goodbyes with that restrained awkwardness that has broken more hearts than any florid declaration could. Ciri clung harder than she had meant to. He promised, as people do, that he would return when he could. When he rode away, she stood in the gate's shadow until his white head was a dot, then nothing. Nenneke did not offer comfort. She put a hand lightly on the girl's shoulder, squeezed once, and said that the midday bell would be ringing soon, and Melitele did not wait for anyone's heartbreak to finish. There were beds to make, and bread to bake, and a new student in need of a schedule. I arrived some weeks later, drawn by a letter from Nenneke that contained very little information and a great deal of underlined emphasis. "Come," she wrote, "bring your lute, bring your wits. Leave your vanity at the door, there is no room for it." When I walked into the courtyard, the first thing I saw was a girl balancing on the low edge of a fountain, arms outstretched, eyes closed. Her hair, lighter than the stone, caught the light like a warning. She moved along the rim with the care of someone practicing a different kind of balance than the one the beam at Kaer Morhen had demanded. "Ciri!" Nenneke called, not loudly. The girl opened her eyes, wobbled, hopped down with more grace than I will ever manage. "This," said the priestess, "is Dandelion. Try not to let him teach you anything important." It was, I admit, not the introduction I had hoped for. Ciri looked me up and down, taking in the bright doublet, the lute case, the hair that refuses to obey fashion. She smirked just slightly. "You sing," she said. When properly encouraged, I replied, with a bow that made one of the novices near the door stifle a laugh. The days that followed were unlike any season I have spent at the temple. Life there runs on a rhythm older than any kingdom. Bells mark prayer. Meals, work. Novices scrub floors, tend the sick, copy texts, argue in whispers about doctrines that none of them yet fully understand. Into that steady pattern Nenneke wove Ciri like an unpredictable thread. In the mornings, Ciri rose with the novices, though she was not one of them. She helped carry water, complaining in a low voice that it was heavier than a sword. She assisted in the herb gardens, learning the difference between leaves that heal and leaves that merely smell impressive. Under Nenneke's eye, she read aloud from texts that spoke of Melitele's patience and the sanctity of life, and from others that listed diseases and the best ways to coax stubborn fevers down. She also, to the quiet fascination of the younger novices, practiced with a wooden sword in a corner of the courtyard. Nenneke allowed this on the condition that Ciri did not chip the paving stones. Watching a temple girl in plain linen shift suddenly into fighting stances, clearly learned under harsher tutelage, was like seeing two worlds overlap. Some of the novices tried to imitate her. They were gently but firmly redirected toward their brooms. Afternoons belonged partly to me. Nenneke decided that if the gods had cursed her with my presence, she might as well extract some educational value. So I found myself charged with broadening Ciri's knowledge of the world in ways that did not involve maps or prophecy. We sat under an old tree whose roots had cracked the flagstones in slow triumph. I told her about the larger towns and small villages I had passed through, not the way chroniclers do, but the way someone remembers places by their smells, their songs, the quality of their bread. I explained why a certain lord's generosity must always be viewed with suspicion, and why one should never, under any circumstances, order fish on the third day of a fair. She asked questions that would have done any scholar proud. Why do people believe one god listens better than another? Why do some men become soldiers and others merchants? Why do songs change as they travel, a love story turning into a tale of revenge 2 towns over? I did my best to answer, though sometimes all I could offer was a shrug, and the confession that humans are a confusing species even when you are one. In the evenings, the temple quieted. Lamps were lit, casting gentle halos on stone. The sick slept or muttered, their suffering held for a time within walls that had seen worse and better before. Ciri would sometimes slip into the main hall and sit at the back, while the priestesses spoke soft prayers. She did not always join in, yet the act of sitting there, of being surrounded by voices not raised in command or alarm, did something to the lines of her shoulders. They loosened a fraction. Of course, peace did not mean oblivion. Letters still arrived. Nenneke read some of them in her study with a frown that deepened over time. Triss wrote, and Yennefer, and others whose names made the priestess snort before she composed herself. The outside world pressed in, as it always does. Whispered rumours of sorcerers gathering, of kings planning new moves, of Nilfgaard's emperor facing outward with a gaze like a drawn blade. Nenneke chose what to share with Ciri. She did not lie. She simply portioned the truth like medicine, in doses she judged survivable. The girl, for her part, was not naive enough to believe that the temple was anything other than a pause. She had too many scars inside her already for that. But she learned, for a little while, what it meant to have days governed by candles and chores, rather than by fear and flight. Watching her there, sleeves rolled up, hauling buckets alongside novices who knew nothing of her bloodline, I felt something I do not feel often. Hope, perhaps, though of a fragile sort. It was tempting to imagine that she might stay, that the world would forget its interest, that she could grow up arguing theology with Nenneke and gossiping with the younger priestesses about pilgrims. Tempting and foolish. One evening, as I tuned my lute in the courtyard, Ciri sat beside me, legs stretched out, bare toes tracing patterns on the warm stone. "Do you think it can last?" she asked. "The song," I said lightly, plucking a string. "Or this place." She tilted her head toward the bell tower, toward the gate, toward all the invisible roads beyond it. "This," she said. "I could have lied. Instead, I told her that nothing lasts. Not keeps, not temples, not crowns, not even the most fashionable ballads. What we get are intervals, seasons of calm, pockets of kindness, mornings when the sun feels gentle on our skin. We carry those forward into whatever storms come next. Sometimes they are enough to keep us from drowning." She listened, teeth worrying her lower lip, then nodded as if filing the thought away alongside Yarpen's advice and Triss's breathing exercises. Children collect such fragments. Later, they become the scaffolding on which they build themselves. We like to believe that sanctuaries can keep danger out, that there are doors thick enough and prayers strong enough to hold back a world intent on claiming those we shelter. Yet we still wonder whether every haven, no matter how well guarded, is only a pause between trials, and whether the best we can offer those who rest there is not permanent safety, but memories bright enough to light the road when they must inevitably walk beyond its walls again. If Triss was a hearth fire coaxing warmth into a cold room, then Yennefer of Vengerberg was a storm walking through a doorway and deciding very calmly which furniture to rearrange with lightning. I say this with affection, or at least with the kind of exasperated admiration one reserves for forces of nature and exceptionally talented colleagues. She arrived at the temple on a morning that had begun as uneventfully as any other. The bells had rung. Novices had yawned behind their hands and hastily pretended piety. I had been tuning my lute in the courtyard, trying to decide whether the day required melancholy or mischief. Then the air shifted, the way it does when thunderheads gather beyond the hills. A carriage stopped outside the gate, not ostentatious but well made, too well for a humble pilgrim. Horses that had clearly been bred with opinions of their own stamped and snorted. When the gate opened, Nenneke went out herself, which she did only for trouble, high-ranking guests, or both. I stayed where I was. No one had told me to move, which I chose to interpret as permission to stay and overhear. Some habits are harder to break than others. Yennefer stepped through the gate as if the threshold were bowing to her. Black hair, black and white clothes, violet eyes that could have made the stone columns feel underdressed. A star-shaped jewel at her throat caught the light and threw it back at the world with interest. The years since I had last seen her had not softened anything. If anything, the angles had sharpened. She took in the courtyard in a single sweep, the herb beds, the novices, the aging bard half hidden behind a pillar. Her gaze landed on me for a heartbeat. One eyebrow rose, as if the gods had confirmed her worst suspicions about the kind of people this temple admitted these days. "Yennefer," I said, putting on my most winning smile. "You look—" She cut me off with a small gesture. "Like myself, I hope. You, on the other hand, look exactly as irresponsible as I remember." Nenneke coughed, a sound that could have been laughter if one were feeling optimistic. She did not enjoy witnessing other people's reunions, especially when they threatened to spill sentiment on her clean floors. "Enough," she said. "You are here about the girl, not to audit my current collection of vagrants." At the edge of the courtyard, Ciri had frozen, a basket of dried herbs in her hands. She stared at Yennefer as children stare at storms and strangers, half wary, half enthralled. Here, at last, was the sorceress out of stories. Not Triss, with her warmth and gentle caution, not the patient priestesses, not the gruff witches of Kaer Morhen. This was magic made flesh, walking in on clicking heels. Yennefer's eyes found her. The weight of that gaze would have made a lesser person step backward. Ciri did not. Her fingers tightened around the basket rim instead. Later, when she spoke of this moment, she said that she had felt as if someone had looked straight through skin and bone and seen the knots in her soul. "So," Yennefer said, "this is the famous child of surprise." Nenneke bristled at the phrase. "This is Ciri," she replied sharply. "She is a girl, not a parade title." Yennefer inclined her head a fraction, accepting the rebuke without conceding the point. That was always her way. She could recognize another woman's authority and still reserve the right to disagree with the entire world. The conversation that followed took place in Nenneke's study, behind a door thick enough that even my considerable talents for eavesdropping could not extract more than tones. I heard anger, tempered, concern, disguised as strategy. Yennefer spoke of power, uncontrolled, dangerous both to Ciri and to those around her. Nenneke spoke of childhood, of the need for a person to be more than the sum of their gifts. Between them, I imagined Geralt's name hanging in the air like a third, silent participant. When the door finally opened, decisions had been made. Yennefer stepped into the courtyard where Ciri waited, hands now empty, basket forgotten somewhere among the sage and thyme. "I am to be your teacher," Yennefer announced. There was no preamble. Yennefer despises soft landings. Ciri's mouth opened, then closed. I could almost see the arguments forming. She liked it here. She was learning. She did not want to be handed to yet another adult with a plan. But something in Yennefer's presence made defiance feel like a smaller, pettier thing. "Do I have a choice?" Ciri asked at last. That question. The first real question of growing up. Yennefer regarded her for a moment. "Not about whether you will learn," she said. "Your power will not go away because you close your eyes. But you will have a say in how we do this. That is more than most are ever offered. It was not comfort, exactly. More like an honest ledger laid on the table." Ciri nodded slowly. She had lived long enough with nightmares to know that refusing to look at something did not make it vanish. The days that followed tested everyone's patience, faith, and occasionally the stability of the temple's masonry. Yennefer approached Ciri's education with the same intensity she brought to negotiations with kings. Mornings were devoted to meditation and control. Sit, breathe, feel the current of magic without grabbing at it. Name sensations. Learn the difference between fear and instinct. To Ciri, who preferred movement, this was torture at first. Sitting still made the ghosts in her head louder. Yennefer, who had once been forced into an education she did not choose, knew that resistance intimately. She did not soften the exercises, but she recognized when to shift tactics. "Imagine a sword," she told Ciri. "Left lying in the street. Any hand can pick it up. A drunk, a child, a thief. Now imagine it sheathed at your side, balanced to your grip, drawn only when you decide. Your power is the sword. Choose how you wish to carry it." In the afternoons, they moved to practical work. Small objects at first, pebbles, candles, a feather on a string. Yennefer taught Ciri how to move them without flinging them against the wall, how to call a spark without starting an accidental fire. When Ciri's control slipped and a candle toppled, Yennefer's reprimands were sharp but never cruel. "You may not always have the luxury of failure," she said, "so you will practice until failure becomes boring." In quieter moments, I saw flashes of unexpected tenderness, a hand adjusting Ciri's posture, fingers brushing a shoulder with unthinking care. A cloak tugged tighter around her after a long session left her shivering. A rare smile, brief and fierce, when Ciri held a levitated object steady for more than a heartbeat. The girl responded with a mixture of admiration and rebellion. She hated the relentless discipline, yet craved Yennefer's approval. She bristled at being corrected, yet worked late into the evening to master what she had been shown. It is exhausting, being a student of someone extraordinary. Every success feels immense, every misstep a personal disgrace. Nenneke watched all this with folded arms and pursed lips. She respected Yennefer's skill. She did not entirely trust the priorities of the Lodge of Sorceresses from which Yennefer came. More than once I heard their voices rise from across the courtyard. Two formidable women debating whether Ciri's destiny should be shaped by temples, by towers of mages, or by the girl herself. "You cannot protect her from everything by teaching her to be useful to your order," Nenneke snapped one evening. "And you cannot protect her from everything by hiding her among prayers and bandages," Yennefer shot back. They were both right and both wrong, which is how most important arguments go. Ciri, caught in the middle, did what young people have always done. She listened to both, took what she could from each, and began, slowly, to form her own opinions. She prayed sometimes, not always, to Melitele. She studied until her head ached. She practiced sword forms in the early morning fog, then spent the day learning to move a single leaf with her mind. She was being trained to be many things at once: weapon, student, survivor, child. No wonder she often looked tired. I did my part as best I could. I told jokes at dinner when the air grew too heavy. I played songs that had nothing at all to do with destiny, only with embarrassing crushes and drunken mishaps. I reminded Ciri, deliberately, that there was a world of ridiculousness out there beyond prophecies and imperial plans. Even Yennefer, on rarer nights, allowed herself to relax, listening with eyes half closed, as if music were a medicine she would never publicly endorse. The temple, which had once felt like a sealed sanctuary, began to feel more like a crossroads. Letters arrived more often now, bearing careful seals. Yennefer wrote replies, late into the night, her quill scratching like an insect against the quiet. She was arranging the next stage, the journey to Aretuza, where the girl would be judged and examined by women who viewed elder blood as both opportunity and danger. Ciri sensed the approaching change. Her questions shifted. No longer only, how do I do this, but why are they so interested in me? What will they want in return? Yennefer answered as candidly as she dared. "Power always gathers around power," she said. "People will want to own what you can do. Your task will be to remain yourself while they try." It sounded simple. It was anything but. We like to imagine that the right teacher at the right time can fix everything, that a stern but caring guide will smooth the path ahead. Watching Yennefer and Ciri circle each other in that temple, learning when to clash and when to bend, I wanted to believe it. Perhaps you know that feeling, hoping that a mentor, a book, a course will finally make the confusion of your life cohere. But even the best tutorship cannot change the nature of the world into which a student must step. We still wonder whether any amount of discipline and affection could fully prepare a girl for the moment when the storms outside her begin to match the ones that had always quietly been gathering within. If you want to understand how badly people misunderstand prophecy, spend an evening in Oxenfurt with a scholar and a bottle of wine. By the halfway point, they will be quoting ancient verses at you with such passion that you might be forgiven for thinking they had personally dined with the seer who wrote them. By the bottom of the bottle, they will quietly admit that no one actually knows what any of it means. During the time Ciri was with Yennefer at Elander, I found myself in that city of books and misplaced confidence more often than usual. Nenneke, in her subtle way, had suggested that I go and make myself useful by seeing what the universities knew about elder blood that might actually be true. I suspect she also wanted me out from underfoot before Yennefer decided that my presence lowered the intellectual tone of the temple. Oxenfurt's libraries smell the way wisdom is supposed to smell. Dust, parchment, ink, and a faint hint of anxiety. I have never been much of a reader. In the formal sense, life is shorter than most commentary. But I know how to charm my way into restricted sections. A favour ode here, a flattering song there, and suddenly a bard finds himself surrounded by shelves of texts that mages and kings alike might kill to read. Elderblood, Hen Isher, the line of Lara Doran, Aip Shiartaltho's names, turned up in more than one volume. Some made it sound like a blessing, a thread of power woven through certain families, destined to bloom once in a generation. Others treated it like a curse, a stain left by forbidden unions between elf and human, doomed to bring catastrophe whenever it surfaced. One particularly enthusiastic treatise suggested that anyone carrying the blood would inevitably reshape the world, whether they tried to or not. I thought of Ciri then not as heir or symbol, but as the girl I had met in Nenneke's courtyard, balancing on the edge of the fountain. I imagined putting that treatise in her hands and telling her that some long-dead scholar had decided she would inevitably reshape the world. It sounded less like destiny and more like a sentence. In a tavern near the university gates, I quizzed a few lecturers who had drunk enough to forget the usual caution about discussing such matters within earshot of strangers. They spoke of genealogies that wound through Cintra's royal house like stubborn ivy. They argued about which branch of the family tree truly carried Lara Doran's legacy, trading names and dates as if they were chips in a game. "So you're telling me," I said at one point, "that you can trace every marriage, every affair, every bastard child from Lara Doran's time to now?" "Of course not," one of them scoffed. "Records are incomplete. Many lines are only theoretical." "Ah," I replied, "so the most important parts are guesses." He bristled and tried to rephrase the word guesses into something more dignified, reconstructed possibilities, I believe, but the meaning remained the same. A great deal of what was being asserted about elder blood rested on foundations of assumption and desire. People had decided what they wanted the story to be and were now arranging the evidence accordingly. This is not unusual. We do the same with our own families. Perhaps you have an uncle convinced that your lineage is full of secret nobility, basing the claim entirely on a faded coat of arms and his fondness for expensive wine, or relatives who insist that a single ancestor's bravery proves some eternal trait that all of you are morally obliged to uphold. We take a few scattered facts, stitch them together with wishful thinking, and call it identity. While scholars argued over charts and sagas, Yennefer was doing something far more practical with the same raw material. Through her letters to Nenneke, which I was occasionally allowed to read when the priestess left them lying around by accident, I glimpsed how Ciri's training had shifted. The girl was no longer simply learning to control bursts of power. She was beginning to name what moved within her. Yennefer taught her the old stories, but differently than the books did. Not as romantic tragedies or dry chronicle, but as warnings. Lara Dorren, an elven sorceress who had dared to love a human and pay the price for challenging both their worlds. The child that union produced, hunted as a threat. The lines that followed, criss-crossing kingdoms, carrying in their veins something neither elves nor humans could comfortably claim. What they want from you, Yennefer wrote once, is not you. It is that story, continued. They will try to make you stand where Lara stood, or where her enemies stood. Your task is to stand where Ciri needs to stand. It is a subtle difference, and an important one. Too often, prophecy becomes a script into which people force themselves, or are forced. Tell a child often enough that she is destined to repeat someone else's life, and she may stop looking for ways to live her own. News also reached me from less polite sources. Spies in Oxenfurt talk as easily as scholars, provided you frame your questions in the right key. A Redanian with a nose like a disappointed hawk leaned across a tavern table one night and asked me very softly what I knew of a girl under the protection of a certain raven-haired sorceress. Only that she sings terribly, I answered. Truly, appallingly. If you are worried she will charm the world into submission with her voice, you may set that fear aside. He did not laugh. Spies rarely do. But his silence told me enough. Somewhere in Redania's tangled network of informants and informers, Ciri's existence had already become more than a rumour. Her movements, her companions, her teachers. Everything was being noted, collated, and sent upwards to men who would never in their lives carry water or scrub a temple floor. In one of the university's quieter corners, I came across a young woman copying an excerpt from the famous seer Ithlin. Her pen scratched dutifully across the page. Verses about a white frost, about the end of ages, about a child born of elder blood who would open or close the path to salvation. Do you know what any of that truly refers to? I asked her. She looked up, startled. It refers to the future, she said, as if that settled everything. The future is a large place, I replied. Are you certain you want to pin it on one child's shoulders? She frowned, not so much at the ethics of it as at the challenge to her neat categories. The idea that prophecy might be less a precise map and more a collection of anxious metaphors did not sit comfortably with someone who had just spent 3 hours, carefully inked letters she barely understood. Of course, the sorcerers of the world knew all this too. They had their own copies of Ithlin's words, their own genealogies, their own fiercely held interpretations. Some wished to guide Ciri, others to control her. A few, if rumour is to be believed, to remove her from the complicated equation entirely. Each took the same set of names, Lara, Cintra, Elderblood, and use them to justify plans that served their own alignments. All the while, in a temple courtyard far from these debates, Ciri was being asked to repeat phrases in the elder speech, to shape power into light and wind, to steady her hand when visions tried to drag her elsewhere. Yennefer reported small triumphs, a nightmare interrupted, a spell correctly cast, a question asked that revealed Ciri had been listening more deeply than anyone had realized. She is not only powerful, Yennefer wrote once, in a rare line left unguarded by sarcasm. She is observant. She sees through flattery faster than most kings. That may save her yet. Reading that, I felt an odd mixture of pride and dread. Pride, because I had already seen that clear, sharp gaze measure me when we first met. Dread, because in a world that thrives on illusion, seeing clearly is one of the loneliest burdens. I sang in those months a few songs that touched lightly on these themes. Ballads about inherited debts and names that weigh more than crowns. I kept them vague. No mention of Cintra, no mention of a specific child. I watched the faces in my audiences as I sang. Some smiled sadly, thinking of their own ancestors' mistakes. Some looked away, unwilling to be reminded that they, too, carried stories in their blood that they had not chosen. We like to think that knowing the past will free us from it, that if we can just find the right name, the right prophecy, the right line on the family tree, everything will make sense, and we will know what to do. Yet we still wonder whether our obsession with tracing destinies only tightens the knots we are trying to untangle, and whether a girl like Ciri might have stood a better chance if fewer people had tried quite so hard to decide in advance what her blood was permitted to become. If you walk long enough with someone, you begin to feel the moment when the road between you forks. Even before you see the signpost, the air changes. Conversations grow shorter or longer, or circle around what matters without quite touching it. At Elander, as Yennefer's letters grew more frequent and Nenneker's frown lines deeper, I could feel that shift every time I tuned my lute under the temple's old tree. No one announced it outright at first. There were practical discussions, of course. Yennefer speaking briskly of ships and ports. Nenneker muttering about preparations, about not sending a girl to a conclave of sorceresses with nothing but old tunics and a stubborn chin. Behind the talk of luggage and routes lay the simpler truth. The temple had given Ciri a resting place, but it was never intended to be the end of her journey. Aretuza lay ahead, whether any of us liked it or not. The day Yennefer finally told Ciri was unremarkable in every other respect. Morning bells, chores, the smell of baking bread in the corridors. I was in the courtyard, pretending to practice and actually listening. Ciri sat on the fountain's edge, boots swinging, while Yennefer stood before her like a judge delivering a verdict she herself mistrusted. "It is time," Yennefer said. "You will come with me to Gorsvelen. From there to Aretuza." She did not gild it. Yennefer has many talents, but softening blows is not among them. Ciri's first reaction was the same blend of anger and fear I had seen in Kaer Morhen's letters when she was told she must leave the keep. The temple had become another kind of home, a place of predictable bells, familiar faces, a stern priestess who hid her affection inside bad-tempered advice. To be told, once again, that she must pack up and move toward an unknown life felt like being uprooted just as her feet had grown used to the soil. "I like it here," she said. "I'm learning here. Why do I have to go where they are?" By they she meant the women of the chapter and the lodge, the sorceresses who met in towers and on islands to decide which way power should lean this season. Because, Yennefer answered, they will not stop looking at you until you stand in front of them. Better that you go on your own terms than be taken on theirs. It was, as usual, uncomfortably true. Preparations began at once. Nenneke supervised with the air of someone packing a daughter off to a dangerous school she would gladly burn down if it caused any lasting harm. New clothes were made, sturdy but presentable. Ciri glowered at the fittings, then secretly enjoyed seeing herself in a mirror without stains from garden soil or training dust. Books were chosen and wrapped. Small comforts, a comb, a ribbon, a worn toy rescued from some earlier life were slipped into the bottom of a bag when Ciri wasn't looking. One evening, as the sun turned the cloister arches gold, Nenneke called me into her study. She closed the door behind us with a firmness that made the stone notice. "You will go to Gorsvelen as well," she said. I opened my mouth to make some joke about being in high demand these days. Her expression suggested that humour would be unwise. "Not as escort," she continued. "Yennefer can burn anything that tries to harm the girl. But Ciri will need at least one familiar face in that stinking city, and I refuse to trust its entertainments to the locals. You will play, watch, and report. Report to whom I asked." She gave me a look. "To your conscience, if you have one, and to me when you can." So it was settled. A few days later, we stood at the temple gate in the pale light of early morning. Ciri wore her new travelling clothes, practical yet undeniably chosen with care. Her hair was braided back from her face in a way that made her seem older than she was, or perhaps only revealed how quickly she was aging beneath the weight of expectation. Nenneke embraced her briefly, fiercely, then stepped back before emotion could betray her. She pressed a small amulet into Ciri's hand, a simple disc of worn metal stamped with Melitele's symbol. "If any fool tells you that gods have no patience for stubborn girls," she said, "you may inform them that this one does. Go, learn. Come back if you can." Ciri nodded, swallowing hard, and tucked the amulet under her shirt. Yennefer took her arm with surprising gentleness. I adjusted my lute case, made a frivolous comment about hoping the road to Gorsvelen had decent inns, and was rewarded with a faint, grateful smile from the girl. The journey south was different from the dwarven caravan, different from the mountain roads. Yennefer travelled with the efficiency of someone who has no time for wandering. Where possible, she used portals, those abrupt tiers in distance that make ordinary travellers like myself deeply uncomfortable. Ciri stepped through them with a kind of grim determination, trusting Yennefer's hand more than the magic itself. Between such leaps, we rode or walked, passing through towns where word of war and politics hung in the air like damp laundry. In village squares and city markets, I saw the same patterns I had been watching for months. Prices rising, men of fighting age gathering, not yet under banners, but drawn toward them, posters nailed to walls calling for volunteers or warning of spies. Ciri saw them too. Her gaze lingered on every notice about Nilfgaardian troop movements, every whispered mention of Cintra. Yennefer said little. She was saving explanations for later. or perhaps simply tired of repeating truths that changed twice before they reached their destinations. Gors Velen, when we finally arrived, assaulted every sense at once. The reek of fish and tar from the docks, the shouts of sailors, the clatter of carts over cobbles, the colourful chaos of stalls selling everything from spices to stolen jewellery. Ciri's eyes widened despite herself. She had seen bustling markets with Yarpen, but a port city is a different kind of creature. It breathes in tides and exhales rumours. Yennefer shepherded us through the streets with the unerring stride of someone who had long ago memorized every alley worth using. We passed brothels disguised as respectable inns disguising their more profitable entertainments, and more than one house whose occupants tried to persuade passers-by that their particular god solved all problems for a reasonable donation. "Do not stare," Yennefer told Ciri, without looking back. "Curiosity is healthy. Advertising it is not." We lodged in a house overlooking the harbour, where the view almost compensated for the smell. From the upper window, Ciri could see ships slipping in and out of the bay, like knives moving through dark cloth. Some bore merchant colours, others the discreet insignia of rulers and councils who preferred to pretend they did not trade with certain parties. Aretuza lay across the water on the Isle of Thaned, a shape of stone and towers rising from the sea. On clear days, its silhouette was crisp against the horizon. On misty ones, it seemed half-imagined, a rumour of spires that might disappear if you blinked too slowly. Ciri stood at that window often, watching the light change on its walls. "Is that where they will decide what happens to me?" she asked once. "Some of them will try," Yennefer said. "You will have a say if you are stubborn enough." Ciri snorted softly. "That I can do." In the days before their crossing, the city gave her a final condensed education in human complexity. We visited markets where mages bought rare ingredients alongside housewives haggling over onions. We saw beggars outside gilded doorways, children running errands for merchants whose names were whispered with equal parts respect and resentment. Once, in a narrow lane, a man brushed too close, his hand reaching toward Ciri's purse. She caught his wrist with a reflex born of Kaer Morhen and Yarpen's road, twisted just enough to make him gasp, then let go. His eyes met hers, and in that shared heartbeat 2 futures flickered, one where he cursed her, one where he acknowledged a fellow creature in a hard world. He chose the latter, nodding once before vanishing into the crowd. Small encounters, but they mattered. They taught her that threats did not always wear armour, and that not every dangerous hand needed to be cut off. Yennefer had her own business in Gors Velen, of course. Meetings with other mages in discreet parlours. Discussions behind closed doors where Ciri was not invited, and I was shooed away with the promise of double pay if I found somewhere else to be loudly useful. From snippets and guesses, I gathered that not all sorcerers agreed on what to do with a child of elder blood. Some wanted her trained and bound to their interests. Others muttered about risks too great to tolerate. A few, perhaps, still remembered that she was a person. On the evening before departure, we stood together on the harbour wall. The wind smelled of salt and rotting nets. Aretuza's lights pricked the dusk across the water, a constellation arranged by human hands. "Do you ever wish you were ordinary?" I asked Ciri gently. She considered. Sometimes, she said, but then I think even ordinary people get dragged into wars and famines and stupid decisions made by kings. At least this way, maybe I can do something. There it was again, that clear, unsettling mixture of courage and realism. She did not imagine that destiny would make her happy. She simply refused to believe she must be helpless before it. The next morning, Yennefer and Ciri boarded the ship to Thaned. I remained on the dock, loot case at my feet, a letter from Nenneke in my pocket, and a dozen half-formed songs in my head. Yennefer stood at the railing, one hand resting lightly on Ciri's shoulder. Ciri leaned forward, hair whipped by the wind, eyes fixed on the island that waited. As the ship pulled away, she lifted a hand. I raised mine in answer, feeling that familiar ache of watching someone smaller sail toward a place that had made its name, in my circles, as both sanctuary and snare. We like to tell ourselves that sending a child to a great school, a renowned academy, a prestigious institution, will protect them, polish them, ready them for the world. Arethusa was all of those things in its own formidable way. Yet even as I watched the ship shrink against the glittering water, I could not rid myself of the thought that we were delivering Ciri not just to an education, but to a labyrinth whose builders were still arguing about where to place its exit. We still wonder whether the roads we choose in the name of preparation lead the ones we love toward safety, or merely toward more elaborate kinds of danger, wrapped in stone, scholarship, and the persuasive language of higher purpose. There is a point in every tale where the strings loosen and the last chord fades, leaving only the echo. We have followed Ciri from burning walls to mountain snow, along muddy roads and through temple courtyards, right up to the edge of the sea that lay between her and Arethusa. It would be a neat trick to end the story there. Ship on the horizon, girl on the prow, destiny waiting in tasteful ambiguity. But life is never kind enough to stop at a perfect image. The ship reached the isle. Ciri stepped onto stone that had seen centuries of ambition and fear. Doors opened and closed behind her. Voices assessed, measured, approved, doubted. Plans tightened around her name like a net. And the storm that had been gathering above the continent finally broke. I will not recount all that followed. There are other songs for Thaned, for coup and counter-coup, for the night when mages turned on one another beneath their own banners. You may have heard some of them already, sung loudly by men who care more for spectacle than for truth. What matters for us is simpler and, I think, harder to look at. Despite everything we tried, we did not manage to keep that child from being exactly where the world wanted her most, in the center of the blast. Geralt, Triss, Yennefer, Nenneke, Yarpen, even a fool with a lute, and more opinions than good sense, we all told ourselves we were guarding Ciri. We hid her in keeps and temples, in caravans and crowded cities. We argued about the best walls to place around her. We debated sorcery versus steel, neutrality versus commitment, hiding versus training. At each turn we chose what seemed, at the time, to be the least terrible path. Looking back, I am struck not by our failures of love, but by our limits. Love, it turns out, is not the same as control. We could not decide who she would be. We could not keep our own fears from shaping the choices we set before her. Geralt feared making her into himself. Triss feared the rawness of her gift. Yennefer feared a world that would devour a girl who did not know her own strength. Nenneke feared the gods would stand by and watch human folly claim another child. I feared that, when the songs were finally written, they would excuse all of this as necessary. Ciri walked between our fears like someone crossing a floor full of cracks. She listened, learned, stumbled, got up. Some of the roads we laid for her held, others broke underfoot. Eventually, inevitably, she began to choose her own. That perhaps is the only real victory a guardian can hope for. Not that the child never bleeds, but that when she stands at a crossroads, the decision is hers. I saw her again, later, older, though not by as many years as the change in her eyes suggested. There was more steel in her bearing, more watchfulness in the way she faced doorways and strangers. Yet the girl who had once blown a wooden whistle too loudly in a dwarven camp was still there, buried but not extinguished. She smiled at one of my worst jokes. She rolled her eyes when I tried to flatter her. She asked after Nenneke's roses, which proves that some loyalties sink deeper than politics. We spoke that evening not about prophecy or blood, but about very small things. The taste of bread in one particular village. The way snow looks when you ride into it at dawn. The comfort of a hand on your shoulder when you are pretending not to be afraid. I wanted to ask whether she blamed us for the paths she had been dragged along. Instead, I found myself asking whether she still dreamed of Cintra. Sometimes, she said, but more often I dream of places I have not yet seen. There was no boast in it, no hunger for conquest, just a quiet acceptance that her life would always be moving, pulled and driven by forces both outside and within. When I think of Ciri now, I do not see her only as the lost princess, the child of surprise, the carrier of elder blood. I see a series of small, stubborn moments. A girl on a beam of ice refusing to fall. A student scowling at ink-stained pages. A temple helper hauling buckets at dawn. A would-be sorceress biting her lip as a candle finally flares at her command. None of those moments were in Ithlin's prophecy. All of them are the fabric of who she is. Perhaps that is what we failed to guard most carefully. Not her body, or even her freedom, but the ordinariness inside her. The right to have days that mean nothing to anyone but herself. To be bored, to make foolish mistakes that touch no one beyond the nearest few meters, to sit under a tree and waste an afternoon on a song that will never be sung in a hall. Those are the luxuries we rarely think to protect when empires and omens are in play. And yet I have begun to suspect that it is precisely those small, seemingly insignificant experiences that decide whether a person becomes a tyrant, a martyr, a survivor, or something less easily named. A child who has known nothing but being used by kings, by causes, by prophecies, learns to see other people as tools or threats. A child who has, even briefly, been allowed to simply be, may carry that memory into every choice she makes, and so turn aside from cruelties that might otherwise have seemed inevitable. We cannot rewrite what we lived. Geralt will always have those winters in Kaer Morhen, when he watched Ciri sleep, and wondered whether refusing to believe in destiny had done her more harm than good. Triss will always remember power thrumming under the girl's skin, and the knowledge that her own skills were not enough to tame it. Yennefer will always carry the fierce, bruising pride of having been both the one who pushed Ciri hardest and the one who, for a time, held the line around her. Nenneke will always light a candle and mutter that the gods had better be paying attention this time. As for me, I will always be the man who turned their lives into stories and then lay awake wondering whether I had made them seem too tidy, too noble, too inevitable. Songs demand structure. Life rarely cooperates. Somewhere between the verses there are pauses full of terror and laughter that no melody can fully hold. We like to say, when we have done our best and still fallen short, that fate had other plans. It is comforting to hand responsibility to an invisible playwright. But we still wonder, do we not, where the line truly lies between what the world demands of us and what we choose to give it, between the dangers we can shield one another from and the ones we must simply face together, hands shaking but not entirely alone. So if, after listening to all this, you find your thoughts drifting not to kings and empires, but to some smaller life you have brushed against, some child or friend or stranger whose path once crossed yours, let them drift. Ask yourself what it would mean for them and for you to be not a jailer, not a sculptor, not an author of their destiny, but simply a witness who refuses to look away. Because in the end, that is all I have truly been for Ciri of Cintra, a witness with a lute and a stubborn heart, watching her walk into storms I could not stop, singing of the girl within the legend so that, for as long as the song is remembered, she will never be only what the world tried to make of her.